Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back nearly 3 centuries to walk the cobblestone streets of 1750s Boston, where the air smells of salt, smoke and things you'd rather not identify. Imagine waking up in a cramped wooden house, your breath visible in the cold morning air, your bladder screaming for relief but the only option being a ceramic pot tucked under your bed. The church bells haven't even started their daily assault on your eardrums yet, and already you're questioning every life choice that brought you here. Fair warning, you probably won't survive this. Between the diseases, the food, the medicine that's somehow worse than the diseases, and the general lack of anything resembling modern comfort, the 1750s are not for the faint of heart. But that's exactly why we're here tonight. To discover what life was really like for ordinary people in colonial Boston, one uncomfortable detail at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how this community stretches across the globe, all of us settling in for a little historical journey together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes, and for a moment you have no idea where you are. The darkness is absolute. Not the kind of darkness you're used to, with the soft glow of a phone charger or the distant hum of streetlights filtering through curtains. This is the darkness of a world before electricity. A blackness so complete that you can't see your own hand in front of your face. Slowly, your other senses begin to fill in the gaps. You smell wood smoke faintly from a fire that burned itself out hours ago. You smell something else too, something earthier, more organic. The unmistakable presence of a chamber pot that's been serving its purpose all night. Welcome to 1750s Boston. You're already off to a great start. The bed beneath you is nothing like the memory foam paradise you might be used to. It's a simple wooden frame with ropes strung across it in a crisscross pattern, supporting a mattress stuffed with straw, corn husks, or if you're lucky, feathers. The phrase "sleep tight" actually comes from this era. Those ropes needed regular tightening, or the whole bed would sag in the middle like a sad hammock. And right now you can feel every lump, every poke, every reminder that comfort is a modern luxury you've thoroughly taken for granted. You're not alone in this bed, by the way. Sharing sleeping space is completely normal in colonial Boston. If you're a child, you're probably squeezed in with several siblings. If you're a servant or apprentice, you might be sharing with other household members of similar status. Even married couples often share their bedchamber, and sometimes their bed, with children, relatives or guests. Privacy, as you understand it, simply doesn't exist. The entire family might sleep in a single room, with parents in the main bed and children on trundle beds that slide underneath during the day. Historians still argue whether this lack of privacy created stronger family bonds or simply made everyone irritable and desperate for personal space. Either way, you're currently pressed against someone who definitely needs a bath. As your eyes slowly adjust, you begin to make out the dim outlines of your surroundings. The room is small, perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, with walls of rough-hewn wooden planks. A single window, covered with oiled paper rather than glass being expensive and rare, lets in the faintest suggestion of approaching dawn. The floor beneath is bare wood, cold enough to make you reconsider whether you really need to use that chamber pot right now. The ceiling is low, with exposed beams that you'll definitely hit your head on at least once today. The whole space has a slight tilt to it, because perfectly level construction is another thing the 18th century hasn't quite mastered. The furniture is sparse but functional. A wooden chest holds whatever clothing and possessions you own, which isn't much. A small table, maybe a chair or two, a cradle if there's an infant in the family. Everything is handmade, often by family members or local craftsmen, built to last because nobody can afford to replace things regularly. There's a hearth against one wall, the heart of the home, currently cold and dark but absolutely essential for cooking, heating, and providing the only reliable light source once the sun goes down. You'll become intimately familiar with that hearth. Your entire life revolves around it. Somewhere in the distance a rooster crows, then another. Then what sounds like every rooster in Boston decides to join the chorus, because colonial cities are absolutely filled with livestock. Chickens, pigs, goats, cows, they all live alongside humans in close quarters. The rooster's cry is your alarm clock, the signal that darkness is retreating and it's time to face another day. There are no snooze buttons in the 1750s. There's no lying in bed scrolling through your phone for 20 minutes. When the rooster crows, you get up because daylight is precious and there's work to be done. But first, those church bells. Even before you've fully risen, the bells of Boston's many churches begin their morning call. The Old South Meeting House, the Old North Church, King's Chapel, their bells ring out across the city in a cascading symphony that's impossible to ignore. These bells aren't just calling people to prayer, though that's certainly part of it. They regulate the entire rhythm of colonial life. They announce the time, because most people can't afford clocks. They signal emergencies, they mark important events, and they remind everyone, constantly, that the church is watching. The Puritan influence that founded this city may have softened somewhat by the 1750s, but religion still permeates every aspect of daily existence. Those bells are the voice of God, or at least the voice of a community that takes God very, very seriously. You swing your legs over the side of the bed, and your feet hit the cold wooden floor. The shock travels up your spine, and you briefly consider crawling back under the covers. But you can hear movement elsewhere in the house. Someone is already up, probably starting a fire in the kitchen hearth, and the smell of wood smoke is beginning to drift through the gaps in the floorboards. In colonial Boston, the household rises together, works together, and survives together. Individual schedules are a luxury no one can afford. The room you're in might be on the second floor of a modest wooden house, typical of Boston's residential areas. The city in 1750 is home to roughly 15 to 16,000 people, making it one of the largest urban centres in British North America, though by today's standards it would barely qualify as a small town. The houses are packed closely together, built of wood and extremely vulnerable to fire, a fact that terrifies city officials and will lead to several devastating fires over the coming decades. The streets outside are narrow and winding, following no particular grid pattern, a remnant of the city's organic growth from a small Puritan settlement into a bustling colonial port. You reach for the chamber pot, because some needs are universal regardless of the century. Chamber pots are ceramic or metal vessels kept under the bed or in a corner, used for obvious purposes throughout the night. In the morning, someone, usually a woman or servant, has the delightful job of emptying these pots. In nicer homes, the contents might go into a designated cesspit. In less nice situations, well, let's just say that the streets of Boston aren't dirty entirely by accident. The concept of indoor plumbing is centuries away. Running water, flush toilets, sewage systems, these are the stuff of fantasy. You're going to become very comfortable with discomfort. Here's a quirky detail that might surprise you. Some colonists use something called a close stool, which is essentially a chair with a hole in the seat and a chamber pot beneath. It sounds primitive, but it was actually considered quite refined. Wealthier families might have close stools with padded seats and decorative woodwork, because apparently, if you must relieve yourself into a pot, you might as well do it in style. The close stool would be kept in a small private closet if the home was grand enough, which is where we get the term water closet, that later evolved into simply toilet. So the next time you use a restroom, you can thank a colonial Boston merchant for the linguistic journey. The air in the room is stale and cold. Ventilation isn't a priority in colonial home construction. In fact, keeping drafts out is far more important, given the brutal New England winters. The windows stay closed, the doors sealed, and fresh air is something you only get when you venture outside. This creates a particular atmosphere inside colonial homes, a blend of smoke, sweat, cooking smells, and all the other odours that humans generate when living in close quarters without modern hygiene. You'll get used to it. Everyone does. Your nose adapts remarkably quickly when there's no alternative. You rise fully now, standing in the dim morning light, preparing to face a day in 1750s Boston. The floor creaks beneath your weight, another reminder of the house's wooden construction. You can hear the family stirring, voices murmuring, the clatter of someone handling pots near the hearth. The bells continue their ringing, softer now, the first announcement of a morning settling into the background noise of the city. Somewhere a dog barks, somewhere else. A merchant is already opening his shop, hoping to catch early customers. The waterfront just a few blocks away is waking up to receive ships that have crossed the Atlantic. This is your world now. A world of chamber pots and church bells, of shared beds and cold floors, of wooden houses and uncertain futures. A world where tomorrow isn't guaranteed, and every sunrise is earned through the hard work of simply surviving. You take a deep breath of that stale, smoky air, and you prepare to begin your day. But first, you really should do something about that bed hair. Unfortunately, mirrors are expensive, Combs are a luxury, and your hair is about to become the least of your problems. The cold floor bites at your feet as you stand in the dim morning light, and you realise with dawning horror that getting dressed in 1750s Boston is going to be an ordeal. There's no grabbing a t-shirt and jeans from the closet here. Clothing in the colonial era is complicated, layered, and seems specifically designed to make your life difficult. You're also not starting with a nice hot shower to ease you into consciousness. In fact, the very concept of daily showering would strike your colonial neighbours as bizarre and possibly dangerous. Water, after all, is believed by many to carry disease directly through the skin. Better to stay dirty than risk opening your pores to illness. This is the medical wisdom of the age, and arguing with it will get you nowhere. So instead of showering, you approach a wash basin, if you're lucky enough to have one. It's a simple ceramic or wooden bowl filled with water that was drawn from a well yesterday, and has been sitting overnight, developing a thin film of ice on top if the season is cold enough. You break through that ice with your fingers, already regretting consciousness, and splash some of this frigid water on your face. That's it. That's your morning wash. Maybe you'll wet a cloth and wipe down your hands, your neck, the parts of you that seem most urgently in need of attention. A full bath is a rare event, happening perhaps once a month if you're particularly fastidious, and it involves the laborious process of heating water over the fire and filling a wooden tub that the whole family will likely share one after another in the same increasingly murky water. Your teeth present another challenge. Toothbrushes exist in the 1750s, but they're far from common. The earliest versions are twigs with frayed ends, or small brushes made from animal hair, usually horse or boar, attached to bone or wood handles. Most colonists, however, simply rub their teeth with a cloth, perhaps dipped in salt or sage, and call it good. The result is exactly what you'd expect. Dental hygiene in colonial America is atrocious by modern standards. Tooth decay is rampant. Tooth extraction is a common and horrifying procedure performed by barbers and blacksmiths, and bad breath is universal enough that nobody particularly notices it. That pleasant morning kiss with your spouse? Both of you smell like you've been gargling pond water and regret. Now comes the clothing, and this is where things get genuinely complicated. If you're a man in colonial Boston, you're looking at multiple layers that must be assembled in a specific order. You start with a linen shirt, worn directly against the skin. This shirt is your primary undergarment. Underwear as you know it doesn't really exist. The shirt is long, reaching to your mid-thighs, and it serves the crucial function of protecting your outer clothing from your body's oils and sweat. Linen can be washed. Wool and other fabrics cannot be easily cleaned. So your shirt gets changed perhaps once or twice a week, depending on your means and how much you've been sweating, while your outer garments might go months without washing. Over the shirt come your breeches, those knee-length pants that button or tie just below the knee. You'll pull on stockings that reach up to meet the breeches, held in place by garters tied around your legs. Already you're dealing with more fasteners than a modern outfit would require for a formal wedding. The breeches themselves button at the waist and often have a distinctive front flap that buttons closed, the precursor to the modern fly but far more elaborate. Getting dressed is a process that takes real time and attention. There's no throwing on sweatpants and calling it done. Next comes the waistcoat, that vest-like garment that buttons up the front and provides an additional layer of warmth and formality. Over the waistcoat goes the coat itself, with its long skirts, large cuffs, and decorative buttons. The coat defines your status. Its fabric, its colour, its condition all announce to the world exactly where you stand in colonial society. A gentleman wears fine wool or silk. A labourer wears rough homespun. There's no hiding your class when your clothing speaks so loudly. For women, the process is even more laborious, and here's where you really start to appreciate modern fashion. A woman's morning begins with a shift, the female equivalent of the man's shirt, a long linen garment worn directly against the skin. Over the shift come stays, the precursor to the corset. These are stiff, boned garments that lace up the back or front, designed to shape the torso into the fashionable silhouette of the era. Getting into stays without help is nearly impossible, which is why colonial women often relied on each other, sisters, mothers, servants, to dress. The stays aren't necessarily uncomfortable when properly fitted, despite what popular culture might suggest, but they do restrict movement and require adjustment throughout the day. Over the stays come multiple petticoats, 1, 2, sometimes 3 or more layers of skirts worn for warmth and to create the proper shape. Then the actual gown or jacket and skirt combination, pinned or tied in place. The whole ensemble involves dozens of pins because buttons are expensive and zippers won't be invented for another century and a half. Getting dressed as a colonial woman requires a minimum of 20 minutes even with practice, and heaven help you if you need to use the bathroom once you're fully assembled. There's a reason making water was a considered activity requiring advanced planning. Here's a fun quirk about colonial clothing: pockets. Women's clothing of this era doesn't have built-in pockets like men's. Instead, women wear separate pocket pouches tied around their waist, accessed through slits in their petticoats. These pockets are often beautifully embroidered and can hold a surprising amount: money, keys, handkerchiefs, small tools of daily life. Losing your pocket or having it cut by a thief is a genuine disaster. The phrase "to pick a pocket" comes from this reality of separable, vulnerable pockets. Historians still argue whether colonial women found their clothing oppressive or simply normal. Modern assumptions about stays being torture devices don't entirely hold up under scrutiny. Working women needed mobility, and wouldn't have worn garments that prevented them from doing their jobs. The stays provided back support for long hours of labour, and served as a kind of proto-sports bra during physical work. Context matters when judging the clothing of the past. Now here's something that might surprise you. Coffee exists in 1750s Boston, but it hasn't yet conquered the morning routine. The dominant hot beverage of the era is tea. Glorious, British, heavily taxed tea imported from the East and served in homes throughout the colonies. Coffee houses exist and are popular gathering spots for men discussing business and politics. But at home, in the morning, you're far more likely to be offered a cup of tea if you're offered a hot beverage at all. Many colonists simply start their day with small beer, that weak, slightly alcoholic drink that's safer than water and provides a gentle morning buzz. Yes, people in the 1750s often begin their day with alcohol. The water supply is questionable at best. Fermented beverages are trusted, and nobody thinks it's strange to give children watered-down beer with their breakfast porridge. Speaking of that breakfast porridge, don't get too excited. The concept of breakfast as a distinct, important meal is still developing in colonial America. For most working people, the morning meal is quick, simple, and meant to provide fuel for hours of labour ahead. You might get a bowl of hasty pudding, which is essentially cornmeal mush, boiled in water or milk until it reaches a consistency somewhere between oatmeal and paste. Maybe some molasses for sweetness if the household can afford it. Maybe some bread, dark, dense, nothing like the fluffy loaves you're used to. Perhaps spread with butter or dripping. The wealthy might enjoy more elaborate fare, but for ordinary Bostonians, breakfast is utilitarian, not enjoyable. The morning routine also involves certain spiritual obligations that we modern folks might overlook. Family prayer is expected in many households, particularly those with strong religious convictions. The head of the household, almost always the father, might read from the Bible, lead the family in prayer, and offer guidance for the day ahead. This isn't optional, this isn't suggestion. In Puritan-influenced Boston, neglecting family worship is a moral failing that neighbours will notice and possibly report. Your spiritual life is public business, and starting the day without acknowledging God is starting the day wrong. As you finish dressing, layering on all these garments that suddenly make you appreciate the simplicity of modern clothing, you catch a glimpse of yourself in whatever reflective surface is available. Mirrors with actual glass are expensive luxuries. You might have a small hand mirror if you're fortunate, or you might rely on polished metal, still water, or simply the judgment of family members who'll tell you if your wig is crooked. Yes, wigs. Men of any social standing often wear wigs, powdered white or grey, covering their natural hair, which is kept short beneath. Wigs require maintenance, powdering, and careful storage. They also host their own tiny ecosystems of lice and other parasites, which is partly why they became fashionable in the first place. Better to have bugs in a wig you can remove than in your actual hair. The bells outside have settled into their usual pattern now, marking time as reliably as any clock. The household is fully awake, the fire is burning in the kitchen hearth, and the smell of smoke and cooking is filling the house. You're dressed. You're somewhat clean by 1750s standards, and you're ready to face the day. Your stomach growls, reminding you that breakfast awaits, however humble it might be. But before you head downstairs to that waiting bowl of mush, take a moment to appreciate what you've already accomplished. You've navigated a world without running water, without central heating, without elastic waistbands or zippers, or any of the 1,000 small conveniences that make modern mornings bearable. You've started your day in colonial Boston, and you've survived the first hour. The church bells are ringing, the rooster is still crowing, and somewhere in the streets below the city is coming alive. Only 16 or 17 more hours until you can collapse back into that lumpy, shared, rope-strung bed. The stairs creak beneath your feet as you descend toward the kitchen, each step announcing your presence to anyone listening below. Colonial houses are not built for stealth. Every floorboard, every door, every piece of furniture seems designed to broadcast your movements to the entire household. Privacy in 1750s. Boston is not just scarce, it's nearly non-existent. The walls are thin, the rooms are small, and everyone knows everyone else's business simply by paying attention to the sounds of daily life. The kitchen is warm, finally after the cold upstairs chambers. Someone has been up for an hour already, coaxing the hearth fire back to life from the banked coals of last night. Fire is precious, and letting it go completely out is both wasteful and dangerous. Restarting a fire from scratch requires flint and steel, patience and dry tinder that might not always be available. So the coals are carefully preserved overnight, buried under ash to keep them alive, then breathed back into flame each morning with gentle blowing and the addition of kindling. This is a skill every colonial person learns early, because fire means survival. You settle onto a bench near the long kitchen table, and breakfast appears before you. Don't let the word breakfast create any false expectations. This is not a spread of eggs, bacon, toast, and fresh orange juice. That kind of morning feast won't exist for ordinary people for another century or more. What you're looking at is a wooden bowl filled with something that resembles thick, greyish porridge. This is hasty pudding, the staple breakfast of colonial New England, made from cornmeal boiled in water until it reaches a consistency that can only be described as enthusiastically mediocre. Cornmeal is the backbone of colonial American cuisine, a gift from the indigenous peoples who first cultivated maize and taught European settlers how to use it. The Puritans who founded Boston might have literally starved without corn in those early years, and by the 1750s it remains the most reliable, affordable grain available. Wheat is grown in the middle colonies, but it's more expensive and often reserved for bread on special occasions. Corn, on the other hand, can be ground into meal, boiled into mush, baked into bread, or fermented into whiskey. It's the Swiss Army knife of colonial grains, and you're going to eat a lot of it. The hasty pudding before you has been sweetened slightly with molasses, that thick, dark syrup imported from the Caribbean sugar plantations, where enslaved Africans labour under brutal conditions to produce the sweetness that makes colonial life a little more bearable. You don't think about this as you eat. Most colonists don't. The connection between the molasses in your breakfast and the human suffering that produced it exists, but it's abstract, distant, easy to ignore when you're hungry and the porridge is warm. This is one of the uncomfortable truths about colonial Boston. Its economy is deeply entangled with the Atlantic slave trade, even when that connection isn't immediately visible. Along with your porridge, you might receive a slice of bread. Colonial bread is nothing like the soft, white, pre-sliced loaves of the modern supermarket. It's dark, dense, and chewy, made from rye, cornmeal, or a mixture of grains that gives it a hearty, almost challenging texture. This bread requires serious jaw work. It's often a day or two old, because baking is labour-intensive and happens on a schedule rather than daily. Fresh bread is a treat, stale bread is the norm. You learn to dip it in your porridge, softening it enough to be edible, making the most of every calorie. And then there's the beverage situation, which continues to surprise modern sensibilities. You might be handed a mug of small beer to wash down your breakfast. Small beer, sometimes called table beer, is a weak alcoholic drink brewed from the second or third runnings of the grain used to make stronger beer. It contains only 2 or 3% alcohol, not enough to get you drunk, but enough to make the water safe to drink. Because that's the real issue here. You cannot trust the water. Boston's water supply in the 1750s comes from wells and springs, and while it's better than in many cities of the era, it's still not reliably clean by modern standards. Diseases like typhoid, dysentery and cholera spread through contaminated water, and while colonists don't fully understand germ theory, they know from experience that fermented drinks don't make people sick the way plain water sometimes does. So everyone drinks beer, cider, or other mildly alcoholic beverages as a matter of course. children drink small beer, pregnant women drink small beer, your grandmother drinks small beer, is not considered drinking, it's considered hydration. Here's a quirky fact that might make you smile. Colonists in this era often viewed water drinkers with suspicion. Choosing to drink water when beer or cider was available suggested poverty, eccentricity, or possibly dangerous ideas about health. Benjamin Franklin, who lived in Boston during his youth before moving to Philadelphia, would later note the strange English habit of drinking water and how it marked him as an outsider in certain circles. Water was for animals, for washing, for emergencies. Civilized people drank something that had been through the magical purifying process of fermentation. If tea appears at your breakfast table, it's a sign of relative prosperity. Tea is imported from China through the British East India Company, and it's heavily taxed, a taxation that will become rather significant in about 20 years, when some locals decide to throw it into the harbour. But for now, tea is a respectable, if expensive, morning drink for those who can afford it. The tea service itself might be a family's prized possession. Porcelain cups, a silver teapot if the family is truly wealthy, all displayed prominently as evidence of good taste and financial success. The conversation at the breakfast table is likely practical rather than philosophical. There's work to be done, tasks to be assigned, the day's schedule to be discussed. The head of the household might outline expectations for each family member, chores for the children, errands to be run, work that needs completing before nightfall. Colonial families function as economic units, with every member contributing to the household's survival. There's no such thing as a child who's too young to help, no concept of retirement, no safety net of government assistance. You work because everyone works, from the moment you're capable until the moment you're dead. Historians still argue whether colonial families were closer or more strained than modern ones. On one hand, they spent virtually all their time together, laboured side by side, depended on each other completely. On the other hand, that constant proximity left a little room for individual identity, personal growth, or escape from difficult relationships. If you didn't get along with your family, tough luck, you were stuck with them anyway. The nuclear family fantasy of 2 parents and 2.5 children in a comfortable suburban home is a 20th century invention. Colonial families were large, multi-generational, and inescapable. As you scrape the last of the porridge from your bowl, because wasting food is unthinkable when calories are hard won, you might notice the other items on the table. Perhaps there's cheese, if the family keeps a cow or has access to a neighbour who does. Maybe some preserved meat, salted or smoked to last through the months when fresh food is unavailable. Fruit is seasonal and rare, vegetables are limited to what can be stored through winter, and anything that would spoil quickly is simply not part of the regular diet. The variety of food available in a modern grocery store would be incomprehensible to a colonial Bostonian. The idea that you could eat strawberries in January, bananas from another continent, fresh fish from the Pacific Ocean, these would seem like the fantasies of a madman. Breakfast ends quickly because there's no time to linger. The household is already moving into the rhythms of the workday, and you need to be moving with it. Dishes, such as they are, get scraped clean, rinsed in the same water that will serve multiple purposes before being thrown out and set aside. The table is cleared, the fire is tended, and the next meal is already being planned. In colonial Boston, food preparation is a constant, ongoing process that occupies much of the household's attention and labour. You stand up from the table, your stomach not quite satisfied, but no longer demanding immediate attention. The hasty pudding sits in your belly like a vaguely warm lump, providing the calories you'll need to get through the morning. The small beer has taken the edge off your thirst without clouding your mind. You're fed, after a fashion, and ready to face whatever the day brings. But first, you need to step outside and experience colonial Boston streets in all their malodorous glory. The city is waiting, with its pigs and its mud and its noise and its people. You take a breath of the relatively clean air inside the house, appreciating it one last time before you open the door and enter the chaos of 1750s urban life. The front door swings open, and the morning hits you like a wall of sensation. Sound, smell, sight. Everything is immediate and overwhelming. You're about to discover that colonial Boston is many things, but quiet and clean are definitely not among them. The door closes behind you, and you stand for a moment on the threshold, trying to process what your senses are telling you. The first thing that hits you is the smell. If you've ever wondered what a city smells like without modern sanitation, without garbage trucks, without sewage systems, without any of the infrastructure that makes urban life bearable? Well, here's your answer. It smells like a barnyard that's been marinating in human waste and industrial processes for about 100 years, which is essentially what it is. The streets of 1750s Boston are not streets as you understand them. There's no asphalt, no concrete, no carefully planned drainage systems. The main thoroughfares might be paved with cobblestones if you're lucky, but even these are uneven, broken and treacherous to walk on. Most streets are simply packed dirt, which sounds acceptable until you remember that dirt plus rain equals mud, and mud plus all the organic matter deposited daily by humans and animals equals something approaching quicksand made of nightmare material. You're going to need to watch your step, carefully, for every moment you're outside. And speaking of organic matter, let's talk about the animals. Boston in the 1750s is home to thousands of domesticated animals that roam the streets with a freedom that would horrify modern urban planners. Pigs are everywhere, snuffling through garbage, rooting in the mud, providing a sort of primitive waste disposal service that the city tacitly relies upon. Pigs eat garbage. There's a lot of garbage. The math works out in a disgusting sort of way. But it means you're constantly navigating around swine who have absolutely no interest in yielding the right of way to a mere human. Chickens peck at the ground, scattering when you walk past only to reconvene moments later. Dogs roam in packs, some belonging to households and some belonging to no one, living off scraps and whatever they can scavenge. Horses pull carts and carriages, leaving behind the inevitable evidence of their passing. Cattle are driven through the streets to market, adding their contributions to the biological stew beneath your feet. The city has tried repeatedly to regulate animal keeping, to require fencing, to maintain some semblance of order, but enforcement is spotty and the animals persist. The sounds are equally overwhelming. After the relative quiet of morning, the city has come fully alive with a symphony of commerce and chaos. Vendors cry their wares from every corner. Fresh fish, fresh cod from the bay, oysters, fine oysters, 6 for a penny, milk, fresh milk here. The street sellers have developed a kind of rhythmic calling that carries over the general din, each with their distinctive song that regular customers learn to recognise. Carts rumble over cobblestones with a bone-jarring clatter. Horses whinny and stamp. Dogs bark. Somewhere, a blacksmith's hammer rings out, providing a steady metallic heartbeat to the morning. And then there are the human sounds. Conversations, arguments, laughter, the crying of children, the shouting of men conducting business or settling disputes. Boston is a dense city, packed within its relatively small peninsula, and everyone lives practically on top of everyone else. Privacy in public is as impossible as privacy at home. Your business is everyone's business. Your affairs are subject to community inspection, and anything you say might be overheard by a dozen people you didn't notice listening. The streets themselves follow a pattern that makes sense only if you understand how Boston grew. This wasn't a planned city laid out in careful grids like Philadelphia would be. Boston evolved organically from its Puritan beginnings, with streets following old Native American paths, the contours of the land, the needs of early settlers who built where it seemed convenient without thinking about future traffic patterns. The result is a maze of winding lanes, narrow alleys, and unexpected dead ends that can confuse even long-time residents. You navigate around a pile of refuse that's been dumped in the street. This is completely normal, as there's no municipal garbage collection and people simply throw their waste outside. Hopefully the pigs will get to it before it attracts too many rats. You step over a stream of suspicious liquid running down the centre of the lane, following the slight grade toward the harbour. This is the kennel, the channel in the middle of many streets that serves as an open sewer, carrying away what it can and leaving behind what it can't. The smell intensifies as you pass. Here's something that might shock you. People are dumping chamber pots out of upper-storey windows with only a cursory warning cry of "Gardez-l'eau," a corruption of the French "Gardez-l'eau," or "watch out for the water." Looking up is as important as looking down when walking through colonial Boston. Getting splashed with someone's nighttime output is a genuine hazard, and the perpetrators face only minor fines if caught. The city has tried to regulate this practice, requiring people to carry their waste to designated locations, but enforcement is lax, and old habits die hard. Despite all this, life goes on. Shopkeepers have opened their doors, displaying goods on counters that extend into the street. A cooper rolls barrels toward the waterfront. A woman carries a basket of bread balanced on her head. weaving through the crowd with practiced grace. Children dart between adults, running errands or causing mischief or both. Street life in colonial Boston is vibrant, energetic, and utterly indifferent to the mess beneath everyone's feet. You adapt or you don't survive, and everyone here has adapted. The architecture around you tells the story of a city constantly rebuilding itself. Wooden buildings dominate, pressed close together, their upper stories often jutting out over the street to maximise interior space. These overhangs create a kind of covered walkway effect in some areas, providing shelter from rain but also blocking light and air. Fire is a constant concern. These wooden structures burn with terrifying speed, and Boston has already experienced several devastating fires that swept through entire neighbourhoods. The Great Fire of 1711 destroyed much of the downtown area, and everyone knows another one is just a spark away. Historians still argue whether colonial Boston was particularly filthy compared to other cities of the era, or merely average. London, Paris, Amsterdam. All the major European cities face similar challenges of sanitation, animal control, and urban density. By the standards of the 18th century, Boston was actually considered relatively clean and well-ordered. It had regulations, it had attempts at street cleaning, it had a civic consciousness that tried to address the worst problems. It just didn't have the technology or infrastructure to make those attempts fully successful. You pass by one of Boston's many wharves, and the city's true nature reveals itself. This is a port first and foremost, a place where the Atlantic Ocean meets the American continent, where goods and people and ideas flow constantly between the old world and the new. The wharves extend into the harbour like fingers reaching for the ships that are Boston's lifeblood. Long Wharf, the largest, stretches nearly half a mile into the water, lined with warehouses and shops and counting houses where the business of empire is conducted daily. The air changes as you approach the water. Salt and fish dominate now, with undercurrents of tar, hemp, and the distinctive smell of wet wood. Ships of all sizes crowd the harbour, merchant vessels loading and unloading cargo, fishing boats returning with the morning's catch, small wherries ferrying people and goods between ships and shore. The waterfront is controlled chaos, a dance of ropes and pulleys, crates and barrels, sailors and dock workers who seem to communicate through a language of gestures and grunts. You pause to watch a ship being unloaded. Workers carry crates on their backs, moving in a continuous line between hold and warehouse. What's in those crates? Everything. Wine from Portugal, cloth from England, sugar from the Caribbean, manufactured goods from across Europe, and going out filling the holds for the return journey. Fish, lumber, furs, ships themselves built in Boston's famous shipyards. The city exists because of this trade, grew wealthy on this trade, and depends on this trade for everything that makes it more than a small settlement clinging to the edge of a vast continent. The harbour is also beautiful in its own way. The morning light glitters on the water, seabirds wheel overhead, crying in their distinctive voices. The islands of Boston Harbour dot the distance, some inhabited, some wild. On a clear day, you can see for miles, across a bay that indigenous peoples fished for thousands of years before any European sail appeared on the horizon. There's a romance to seaports, a sense of possibility and connection to distant places that even the smells and sounds of commerce can't entirely dispel. You take a deep breath, regretting it immediately given the olfactory situation, and prepare to continue your exploration. The waterfront is calling, with its ships and sailors and stories from across the world. Colonial Boston is dirty, smelly, loud and chaotic. It's also alive in a way that sanitized modern cities sometimes aren't, buzzing with the energy of thousands of people working, trading, surviving, dreaming. The waterfront pulls you forward like a gravitational force, and you find yourself walking toward Long Wharf, that remarkable finger of commerce extending deep into Boston Harbour. The wharf is a city within a city, nearly 2,000 feet of shops, warehouses, counting houses and taverns, built directly over the water, with ships moored alongside like horses at a hitching post. This is where the world meets Boston, where the Atlantic Ocean connects a small colonial city to the vast networks of global trade that define the 18th century. The first thing you notice, beyond the intensified smell of fish and salt, is the incredible diversity of humanity on the waterfront. Sailors from every corner of the Atlantic world work side by side here. Englishmen and Scots, Irishmen and Germans, Africans both enslaved and free, indigenous peoples from nearby nations, men from the Caribbean and South America, even occasionally someone from as far away as India or China. The maritime world is cosmopolitan in ways that the inland colonies are not, and the dock is a place where accents blend into a kind of pidgin commerce speak, where the colour of your skin matters less than your ability to tie a proper knot or haul a proper load. You watch a ship being prepared for departure, and the coordinated chaos is mesmerising. Sailors scramble up the rigging with a casualness that makes your stomach flip, walking on ropes 50 feet above the deck as comfortably as you'd walk across a room. These men, and they are almost entirely men, with women appearing on ships only rarely and in specific circumstances, have skills that take years to develop. They can read the wind by the feel on their cheek, predict weather by the colour of the sky, navigate by stars they've watched since childhood. A good sailor is worth his weight in cargo, and captains compete fiercely for the best crews. The cargo itself tells the story of colonial Boston's place in the world. Coming in, you see crates marked with the names of London merchants, containing everything from textiles to hardware to luxury goods for wealthy colonial consumers. Wine barrels from Spain and Portugal are rolled down gangplanks, destined for taverns and private cellars. Sugar and molasses from the Caribbean, produced by enslaved labour on brutal plantations, will be transformed into rum in Boston's many distilleries. This rum will then be traded for more enslaved people in Africa, completing a triangular trade that enriches some while destroying countless others. The economics of the colonial Atlantic are soaked in blood, even when the ledgers look merely like columns of numbers. Going out, the ships carry the products of New England's land and labour. Fish is the biggest export. Dried, salted cod that can survive months of voyage to feed enslaved people in the Caribbean, Catholic populations in Europe during Lent, and markets across the known world. New England fishing boats venture as far as the Grand Banks off Newfoundland, harvesting the seemingly endless schools of cod that have been drawing European fishermen to these waters since before Columbus. The phrase sacred cod isn't a joke in Massachusetts. This fish built the colony's economy and remains central to its identity. Lumber is another major export. The vast forests of New England provide timber for shipbuilding, furniture making and construction across the Atlantic world. White pine in particular is prized for ship masts, and the largest trees are reserved by law for the Royal Navy, marked with the King's broad arrow to prevent colonial use. This policy rankles many colonists, who feel that their own resources are being claimed for distant imperial purposes. It's one of many small grievances accumulating beneath the surface of colonial loyalty. You pass by a group of sailors engaged in animated conversation, and you catch fragments of stories about their voyages. One is describing a storm off the coast of Virginia that nearly sank their vessel. Another is complaining about the food aboard ship. Salt pork so hard it could be carved into buttons. Biscuits so infested with weevils that men learned to eat in the dark to avoid seeing what they were consuming. A third is laughing about a port in the Caribbean where certain pleasures were available for a sailor's wages. The conversation is rough, profane, and completely authentic to the world these men inhabit. Here's something fascinating about colonial sailors. They were among the most radical people in the Atlantic world. Living outside the normal structures of society, moving constantly between cultures and continents, they developed their own egalitarian traditions that seem startlingly modern. On many ships, the captain's authority was limited by crew agreement, and major decisions were made by vote. Sailors shared in the profits of the voyage rather than simply earning wages. They had early forms of disability insurance, with crew members contributing to funds that would support those injured in service. This tradition of maritime democracy would influence revolutionary thinking in the decades to come, when sailors proved to be among the most enthusiastic participants in colonial protests against British authority. Historians still argue whether colonial Boston's maritime economy was progressive or exploitative. On one hand, it provided opportunities for social mobility that didn't exist in more stratified European societies. A poor boy who proved himself capable could rise to become a ship's captain, a merchant, even a wealthy man. On the other hand, that same economy depended fundamentally on enslaved labour in the Caribbean, on the exploitation of sailors who faced brutal working conditions, on fishing boats where men routinely died at sea. The wealth you see on display in Boston's finest homes was built on a foundation of suffering that the wealthy preferred not to examine too closely. Speaking of wealth, you notice the merchants moving among the commerce with an air of authority. These are the men who own the ships, finance the voyages, buy and sell the cargoes that pass through Boston Harbour. They wear finer clothes than the sailors, carry themselves with the confidence of success, and conduct business with handshakes and verbal agreements that bind as surely as any written contract. The merchant class of colonial Boston is creating a new kind of aristocracy, one based on money rather than birth, on commercial acumen rather than hereditary titles. It's a distinctly American development, though the merchants themselves would be horrified to be described as anything other than loyal British subjects. You watch a transaction unfold at a counting house window. A ship's captain presents his cargo manifest to a merchant's clerk, who checks the numbers against expected deliveries. Currency changes hands, probably not actual coins, but bills of exchange, those paper promises that allow complex transactions to occur without the physical movement of heavy metal money. The merchant himself appears, reviews the paperwork, asks a few questions about the voyage. Goods that left England months ago have finally arrived, and now they'll be distributed to shopkeepers throughout Boston and beyond, eventually finding their way into the homes of ordinary colonists. The waterfront is also a place of information exchange. News from across the Atlantic arrives with every ship, sometimes months old by the time it reaches Boston. What's happening in London? Has the king made any important decisions? Are there wars being fought in Europe that might affect colonial affairs? Sailors and ship captains are walking newspapers, carrying gossip and intelligence that spreads through the taverns and counting houses before appearing in the official gazettes. In an age before telegraph, telephone, or internet, the speed of information is limited to the speed of a ship crossing the ocean, and the waterfront is where news first touches land. You pause by a shipyard, where the skeleton of a new vessel rises from the ways. Boston builds ships, excellent ships in fact, prized throughout the Atlantic world for their quality and relatively low cost. The abundance of timber in New England, combined with skilled craftsmen and an intimate understanding of the sea, has made shipbuilding a major industry. The men working on this hull are specialists, shipwrights, caulkers, sailmakers, rope makers, each with knowledge passed down through generations. A ship is one of the most complex machines of the pre-modern world, and building one requires coordination of dozens of trades over months of labour. The sight of ships being built, loaded, unloaded, repaired, and sent off across the ocean might make you nostalgic for a world of physical, tangible commerce. There's something visceral about watching goods move with human muscle, about seeing the actual ships that connect continents, about the smell and noise and chaos of maritime trade. Our digital economy has its advantages, but it's lost this immediacy, this sense of the real physical effort required to move things from place to place. But the waterfront workday is demanding, and you've already spent more time gawking than most Bostonians would. They have jobs to do, and you should probably think about what kind of work you'll be doing in this colonial city, because nobody gets to just observe in the 1750s. Everyone works, and the nature of that work defines everything about your life. You step back from the waterfront bustle and consider a question that every person in 1750s Boston must answer. What do you do? Not in the modern sense of what's your career, with its implications of choice, mobility, and personal fulfillment. In colonial Boston, your occupation is your identity, your social position, your daily reality, and quite possibly your entire future. There's no career counselling, no job fairs, no LinkedIn profiles. Your work is determined by your birth, your gender, your family connections, and whatever opportunities happen to cross your path. So let's explore what options might be available to you in this hierarchical, labour-intensive world. If you're a man born into a family of means, you might be destined for one of the learned professions: minister, lawyer, or physician. These are the most prestigious occupations in colonial society, requiring education, training, and a certain social standing to enter. A minister leads the spiritual life of his community, a position of enormous influence in religious New England. A lawyer navigates the complex legal disputes that arise in any commercial society. A physician attempts to heal the sick, though healing in the 1750s often means doing more harm than good. These professionals wear different clothes, speak differently, and move in social circles above the common trades. But most men in colonial Boston are craftsmen, shopkeepers, or labourers, and this is where the real texture of urban work emerges. Consider the trades available: blacksmith, cooper, tanner, cobbler, silversmith, printer, joiner, cabinet maker, mason, glazier, rope maker, sailmaker, baker, butcher, brewer, chandler, hatter, weaver, dyer, tailor, barber, and dozens more. Each trade has its own guild traditions, its own hierarchy from apprentice to journeyman to master, its own secrets passed down through generations. Each fills a necessary role in the colonial economy, producing goods that cannot yet be mass manufactured. The silversmith, for example, holds a particularly honoured position. Paul Revere is working in Boston during this era, though his famous ride is still decades away. He crafts beautiful objects, teapots, tankards, spoons, bowls that serve as both functional items and displays of wealth. Silver is also a store of value. In the absence of reliable paper currency, owning silver objects is like keeping money in a more beautiful form. A silversmith must be artist, metalworker, and businessman all at once, managing a complex trade that requires substantial investment in tools and materials. The printer is another influential tradesman. Benjamin Franklin learned his trade in Boston before moving to Philadelphia, and the skills he developed here would serve him throughout his remarkable life. Printing is a craft that shapes public opinion, spreading news, political argument, and religious instruction throughout the colonies. A printer needs literacy, of course, but also mechanical aptitude to operate the press, business sense to attract customers, and often political savvy to navigate the censorship and controversy that printed words can generate. Let's say you're a young man of modest background with no family trade to inherit. Your most likely path is apprenticeship, binding yourself to a master craftsman for a term of years, typically 7, in exchange for training, room, board, and eventually the skills to make your own living. The apprentice system is the backbone of colonial economic life, the mechanism by which knowledge and skill pass from one generation to the next. Being an apprentice is not glamorous. You'll live in your master's house, subject to his authority almost as completely as a child is subject to a parent. You'll start with the most menial tasks, sweeping the workshop, carrying materials, running errands, and only gradually be trusted with actual craft work. Your master controls your time, your behaviour, even your social life. Apprentices caught frequenting taverns or engaging in other disapproved activities face punishment. The contract you sign, or that your family signs for you, is legally binding, and running away from your apprenticeship is a crime that courts take seriously. But there's a reason young men accept these terms. At the end of the apprenticeship you become a journeyman, free to sell your labour to any master who'll hire you, and if you're skilled and lucky, you might eventually become a master yourself, owning your own shop, taking on your own apprentices, building your own small piece of economic independence. Social mobility is real in colonial America, even if it's neither easy nor guaranteed. For women, the occupational landscape is dramatically different and far more constrained. Most women work. There's no question of leisure for any but the wealthiest, but their work is centred on the household economy. Cooking, cleaning, spinning, weaving, sewing, preserving food, making soap and candles, caring for children, tending gardens and livestock. These endless tasks consume the hours of colonial women. It's work that's essential to family survival, but it's also work that's unpaid, unrecognised, and largely invisible in the official economic records of the era. Some women do participate in commerce more directly. Widows sometimes inherit and run their husbands' businesses. There are women tavern keepers, shopkeepers, and traders who manage successful enterprises despite the legal and social obstacles. Single women might work as seamstresses, laundresses, or domestic servants. A few pursue skilled trades, though they're generally barred from formal apprenticeships and guild membership. The dame school teacher, who runs a small school out of her home teaching young children basic literacy, is a common female occupation. But these opportunities exist in the gaps and exceptions of a system that fundamentally excludes women from public economic life. Historians still argue whether colonial women's domestic labour should be considered work in the same sense as men's craft labour. The tools of feminist history have helped us recognise the economic value of what was once dismissed as just housework. But the fact remains that colonial society itself did not value this labour equally. A woman's work was expected, invisible, and unpaid. A man's work earned wages, status, and social recognition. And then there's the labour of enslaved people, which we'll explore more fully later, but which must be acknowledged here. In 1750s Boston, enslaved Africans and their descendants work in households, on the docks, in craft shops, aboard ships, and throughout the economy. Their labour is legally owned by others, their wages, if any, belonging to their enslavers. The skilled enslaved craftsman who does the same work as a free man receives none of the same recognition or reward. The enslaved woman who performs the same domestic labour as a white goodwife has no claim to even the limited respect that household work occasionally receives. Labour in colonial Boston is not just about craft and commerce, it's about race, status, and the fundamental question of who is considered fully human. Here's something that might surprise you. Many colonial labourers worked incredibly long hours by modern standards. A typical workday might begin at sunrise and continue until sunset, particularly during summer months when daylight extends the productive hours. The weekend, as we know it, doesn't exist. Saturday is a work day, and Sunday is devoted to religious observance rather than leisure. The concept of free time is largely foreign to working people of this era. When you're not working for wages, you're working on household tasks, and when you're not doing that, you're probably sleeping. But work in the 1750s also has rhythms and breaks that moderns might find appealing. The strict clock discipline of industrial capitalism hasn't yet taken hold. Masters might allow apprentices time off for local festivals, work stops for important community events, and the pace of labour often follows the task rather than the hour. There's no time clock to punch, no performance metrics to meet. The relationship between worker and work is different, more personal, more integrated into the whole of life, rather than cordoned off into separate work and leisure spheres. You look around at the workers of colonial Boston, the craftsmen at their benches, the sailors on the docks, the women carrying baskets through the streets, and you see a world of labour that's both familiar and alien. People work to survive, just as they always have and always will. But the shape of that work, the meaning of that work, the social structures surrounding that work, these are peculiar to this time and place. Understanding them is understanding the bones of colonial American society. You find yourself drawn to a workshop doorway, where the rhythmic sound of hammer on metal has been pulsing steadily for the last several minutes. Inside, a blacksmith works at his forge, and beside him, sweating in the heat, is a boy who can't be older than 14. This is apprenticeship in its most immediate form, and watching it gives you a window into how colonial society reproduces itself, how knowledge passes from one generation to the next, how young people are shaped into productive members of the community, how the gap between childhood and adulthood is bridged through years of hard labour. The apprentice system is one of the most important institutions in colonial America, though it's rarely mentioned in history books focused on wars and politics. It's the mechanism that turns children into workers, that allocates human resources to economic needs, that maintains the quality and continuity of skilled trades. Without apprenticeship there would be no craftsmen, no merchants, no professionals. The entire economic structure of colonial society depends on the willingness of masters to train and the willingness of youth to learn. The process begins when a boy reaches the age of around 12 to 14, when he's considered old enough to begin productive work but too young and unskilled to earn independent wages. His parents, guardians, or parish authorities arrange for him to be bound to a master craftsman through a formal legal contract called an indenture. This contract specifies the terms, the length of service, typically 7 years, the master's obligations, training, room, board, and sometimes a payment at the end of the term, and the apprentice's obligations, obedience, diligence, and secrecy about the master's trade practices. Once bound, the apprentice essentially becomes part of the master's household. He lives under the master's roof, eats at the master's table, and falls under the master's authority for all aspects of life. The master stands in the place of a parent, responsible for the apprentice's moral instruction, as well as his craft training. This isn't a job, it's a transformation of identity, as the young person is reshaped from a dependent child into a skilled tradesman. The early years of apprenticeship are often miserable. The young apprentice is the lowest-ranking member of the household, below the master's wife, below any older apprentices, below even the family dog in some practical respects. His tasks are the ones nobody else wants, sweeping the workshop, hauling heavy materials, running errands in all weather, performing whatever menial chores the master or mistress assigns. The actual work of the trade is revealed slowly, as the apprentice demonstrates trustworthiness and capability. But gradually, over months that stretch into years, The apprentice begins to learn. He watches the master work, imitating techniques, internalizing the rhythms of the craft. He's given small tasks, then larger ones, until he's producing work that contributes meaningfully to the shop's output. The master corrects his mistakes, sometimes physically. Corporal punishment for apprentices is legal and common. Refines his technique, shares the accumulated wisdom of the trade. By the end of the apprenticeship, the young man should be capable of performing any task the trade requires. Here's a quirky fact about apprentice life. The contracts often included moral clauses that would make modern employment lawyers blush. An apprentice typically promised not to frequent alehouses or gambling dens, not to engage in fornication, not to marry without the master's permission, not to reveal trade secrets, and not to damage the master's property. Violations could result in extended service. Sometimes the indenture specified that every day lost to absence or misbehaviour would be repaid with multiple days of additional service. Running away from an apprenticeship was illegal, and advertisements for runaway apprentices appeared regularly in colonial newspapers, offering rewards for their return. The master's obligations were equally serious. He was supposed to teach the trade honestly and completely, not holding back essential knowledge. He was supposed to provide adequate food, clothing, and shelter, though adequate was interpreted broadly, and complaints about inadequate provision were common. Some contracts specified that the apprentice would learn to read and write if he didn't already know how, recognizing that literacy was increasingly valuable in a commercial society. At the end of the term, the master might owe the newly minted journeyman a set of tools, a suit of clothes, or a small payment to help him get started in an independent life. Historians still argue about whether the apprentice system was primarily exploitative or primarily educational. Critics point out that masters had strong incentives to work their apprentices hard while teaching them as little as possible, extracting labour while minimising the effort of training. Defenders note that the system successfully transmitted complex skills across generations, created pathways for social mobility, and often fostered genuine bonds between masters and their charges. Both views capture part of the truth. Like most human institutions, apprenticeship was messy, variable, and dependent on the personalities involved. For girls, formal apprenticeship was rare but not unknown. Some girls were bound out to learn housewifery, the domestic skills that would prepare them for marriage. Others were apprenticed to specific female trades, mantua making, a type of women's garment, millinery, or occasionally printing or other crafts where female workers were accepted. But most girls learned their skills from mothers, aunts, and neighbours, through informal instruction that was no less rigorous for being less formally structured. The workshop you're observing falls into a comfortable mid-tier of colonial craft production. The blacksmith is clearly a master of reasonable prosperity. His tools are well maintained, his stock of iron is adequate, his apprentice looks fed if not fat. He produces the metal goods that every household and business needs: nails, hinges, tools, cooking implements, horseshoes, and countless other items. His work is essential but unglamorous, the foundation upon which more visible trades depend. The heat from the forge is intense even from where you stand at the doorway. The blacksmith works with iron that glows orange-white, hammering it into shape with practiced blows that look effortless, but are actually the product of years of muscle memory. The apprentice operates the bellows, pumping air into the fire to maintain its temperature, learning through observation even as he performs this mechanical task. Neither looks up at you, there's no time for distractions when hot metal is involved, and a moment's inattention can result in burns, ruined work, or worse. This scene, master teaching apprentice, skill being transmitted through practice and proximity, has been repeating itself in workshops across Boston and across the world for centuries. It's how human knowledge has been preserved and developed since long before formal schooling existed. The relationship between teacher and student, between experienced and novice, is one of the most fundamental human connections, and in the craft workshop, it takes its most tangible form. You watch for a few more minutes as the blacksmith shapes what appears to be a door hinge, then quenches it in a trough of water that sends steam hissing into the already hot air. The apprentice watches intently, and you can see him filing away the details in his mind. How hot the metal was before quenching, how long the master waited, what the finished product should look like. This is learning, real learning, even if there's no classroom, no textbook, no examination. Eventually you move on, leaving the master and apprentice to their work. but the lesson of the workshop stays with you. Colonial society may seem primitive in many ways, but it had developed sophisticated systems for transmitting knowledge and integrating young people into productive life. The apprentice system wasn't perfect, but it worked, producing generation after generation of skilled craftsmen who built the physical and economic infrastructure of early America. Your stomach rumbles, reminding you that hasty pudding was hours ago, and you begin to wonder where colonial Bostonians acquire the goods they need for daily life. The answer leads you away from the waterfront and into the commercial heart of the city, where shops and market stalls line the streets, offering everything from imported luxuries to locally produced necessities. Shopping in 1750s. Boston is nothing like the modern experience. No big box stores, no online delivery, no standardized prices or packaged goods. Instead, it's a personal, negotiated, surprisingly complex process that reveals much about colonial economy and society. The shops themselves are integrated into the lives of their owners in ways that would seem strange today. Most shopkeepers live above or behind their stores, with the commercial and domestic spaces flowing into each other. The shopkeeper's wife and children often help with the business, and customers might find themselves waiting while the proprietor finishes a domestic task or deals with a family matter. The separation of work and home that defines modern life is simply absent here. When you enter a shop, you're entering someone's life. What's for sale? That depends entirely on what ships have arrived recently. Colonial Boston is an import economy, dependent on goods manufactured in England and traded throughout the Atlantic world. The shop you enter might display fine English cloth, pewter dishes, ceramic cups, iron tools, books from London printers, and luxury items like tea services, glassware, and jewellery. But the inventory changes constantly with the arrival and departure of ships, and something that was abundant last month might be completely unavailable today. The cloth section is particularly important. Colonial Americans can produce some textiles, homespun linen and rough woolens, but fine cloth comes from English mills. Silk, cotton, better woolens, the fabric for fashionable clothing, all of this must be imported, making it expensive and aspirational. The fabric a person wears announces their social position as clearly as a name badge. Shopping for cloth is serious business, involving careful examination of quality, negotiation over price, and consideration of how the finished garment will position its wearer in the social hierarchy. Prices are not fixed. This is perhaps the biggest adjustment for modern shoppers. There's no price tag, no standard rate, no posted menu of costs. Instead, every transaction involves negotiation between buyer and seller. The shopkeeper names a price, the customer counters. They haggle back and forth until reaching an agreement or walking away. Your success at this negotiation depends on your knowledge of the market, your social standing, your relationship with the shopkeeper, and your skill at the verbal dance of bargaining. It's exhausting, but also somewhat thrilling. Every purchase is a small battle of wits. The market itself, as opposed to individual shops, operates on specific days in designated locations. Boston's Faneuil Hall, built in 1742, serves as a market house where farmers and vendors gather to sell produce, meat, and other goods directly to consumers. Here the scene is even more chaotic than in the shops. Vendors cry their wares, customers squeeze between stalls, arguments break out over quality and prices, and pickpockets work the crowd looking for careless marks. The market is a sensory overload of sights, sounds, and smells that would overwhelm anyone expecting the sanitized grocery store experience. Here's something interesting about colonial commerce. Credit is absolutely essential. Very few transactions involve actual cash changing hands. Instead, shopkeepers maintain running accounts for their regular customers, recording purchases in ledger books and settling up periodically, perhaps quarterly, perhaps annually, perhaps never if the customer is important enough. This system depends on trust, reputation, and the relative stability of a small community where everyone knows everyone else. A customer who fails to pay eventually will find their credit refused, but in the meantime, the shopkeeper is essentially extending interest-free loans as a normal part of doing business. The lack of reliable currency makes things even more complicated. We'll discuss money more fully in a moment, but for now understand that colonial shoppers might pay with English pounds, Spanish dollars, paper bills of questionable value, personal IOUs, or barter goods. The shopkeeper has to be part accountant, part currency trader, calculating the relative values of different payment forms while also negotiating the base price. It's a level of financial sophistication that would challenge many modern business owners. Imported goods are expensive, and colonists supplement them with local production wherever possible. A farm wife might bring her butter and cheese to market, earning credit that she'll use for imported goods she can't produce at home. A craftsman might trade his products directly for supplies, bypassing money altogether. The colonial economy is a hybrid system, mixing cash transactions, credit relationships, and barter exchanges in constantly shifting combinations. Understanding how to navigate this complexity is a survival skill for every colonial consumer. Historians still argue about whether colonial Americans were primarily self-sufficient producers or integrated participants in a consumer economy. The traditional view emphasized self-sufficiency, colonial families producing most of what they needed, rarely visiting markets, living largely independent of the cash economy. More recent scholarship has complicated this picture, showing that even rural families were deeply involved in trade networks, purchasing imported goods and producing for market rather than just for home use. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, varying by region, class, and individual circumstance. You pause at a shop window displaying imported ceramics, cups, plates, bowls decorated with designs from English factories. These are not necessities. Colonial families could get by with wooden or pewter dishes, but they're objects of desire, status symbols that announce a family's participation in polite, refined, English-influenced culture. The cups are meant for tea, that most fashionable of beverages, served in a ceremony that replicates rituals being performed in London, Bristol and Boston alike. To own these cups is to belong to the British Atlantic world, to claim membership in a culture that transcends the rough frontier conditions of American life. The shopkeeper notices your interest and emerges to offer assistance. This is a world of personal selling, where the merchant's job is to build relationships, understand customer needs, and guide purchasing decisions. A good shopkeeper knows the economic situations of regular customers, knows what goods might appeal to each, knows how to extend credit wisely while still making sales. It's a social skill as much as a commercial one, requiring tact, memory, and genuine interest in the lives of the people who walk through the door. You explain that you're just looking, a response that probably confuses the shopkeeper, since just looking isn't really a thing in an era before window shopping became a recreational activity. But they're accustomed to browsers and politely return to their work while keeping an eye on you. Theft is always a concern and strangers receive extra scrutiny. The shop also contains goods you might not expect, medicines and medical supplies, because the distinction between general store and apothecary isn't firmly established. Books and newspapers, because knowledge is a commodity like any other. Sewing supplies and notions for the endless mending that every household requires, and sundries of all sorts that someone thought might sell in this particular market. As you leave the shop and continue through the commercial district, you see the full range of colonial retail. There are specialist shops, a silversmith store, a bookseller, a wig maker, serving customers with specific needs and the money to meet them. There are general merchants handling the bulk of imports. There are small traders operating from homes or market stalls, selling what they can at margins too slim for proper shops to bother with. And there are street vendors, mobile sellers, who carry their goods to customers rather than waiting for customers to come to them. Shopping in colonial Boston is work, not recreation. It requires time, energy, knowledge, and social skill. But it's also a form of community participation, a way of maintaining relationships and staying connected to the life of the city. The modern efficiency of grab-and-go retail has its advantages, but something has been lost in the transition from this more personal, more embedded form of commerce. Mention of prices and payment brings us to one of the most confusing aspects of colonial life, the monetary system. If you've ever complained about the complexity of modern currencies, with their exchange rates and inflation and central bank policies, spend a few minutes trying to understand how money works in 1750s Boston, and you'll gain a new appreciation for our relatively orderly financial world. Colonial money is a mess, a fascinating, creative, maddening mess that somehow supports a functioning economy, despite seeming designed to drive everyone insane. The first thing to understand is that there is no single currency in colonial America. The British pound sterling is the official money of account, the standard in which prices are quoted and debts recorded, but actual pound sterling are rare. Most English coins stay in England. The colonies suffer from a chronic shortage of specie, metal currency, that makes cash transactions difficult. What circulates instead is a chaotic mixture of foreign coins, paper money, and improvised alternatives that only sort of work together. Spanish dollars are probably the most common coins you'll encounter. These silver coins, minted from the vast silver deposits of Spain's American colonies, circulate throughout the Atlantic world and serve as a de facto international currency. The Spanish dollar is the ancestor of the American dollar, and its widespread use in colonial commerce explains why the new nation would eventually adopt it as the basis for its currency. In 1750s Boston, you'll see Spanish dollars in various conditions, sometimes cut into pieces, bits, hence 2 bits for a quarter, when smaller denominations are needed. Portuguese coins also circulate, along with French, Dutch, and miscellaneous other European currencies that have found their way into colonial pockets. Each of these has a different value relative to the pound sterling, and these exchange rates fluctuate based on the relative quality of the coins, the state of international trade, and simple supply and demand. Doing the math to convert between currencies is a regular mental exercise for anyone engaged in commerce. You learn to think in multiple denominations simultaneously, or you get cheated. And then there's paper money, which adds another layer of confusion. Several colonies have issued their own paper currencies, backed, in theory, by future tax revenues or land values. Massachusetts Bay has been particularly enthusiastic about paper money, issuing bills that promise eventual redemption in hard currency. These bills solve the shortage problem. There's never a shortage of paper, but they create new problems of their own. Paper money depreciates rapidly as more is issued, meaning the notes in your pocket might be worth less tomorrow than they are today. Merchants have to adjust their prices constantly to account for currency depreciation, and prices quoted in paper money can be many times higher than prices quoted in silver. Here's a quirky fact that illustrates the chaos. Massachusetts actually had to define an official exchange rate between its paper money and silver, creating what was called old tenor and new tenor currencies, when earlier paper money had depreciated too far to be useful. For a while, prices might be quoted in old tenor, new tenor, or silver, with complex conversion rates between them. Imagine trying to buy groceries while doing currency conversions in your head. That's daily life in colonial Boston. The lack of small denomination coins creates particular problems. How do you make change when the smallest available coin might be worth more than the price of your purchase? Colonial solutions are creative, cutting coins into pieces, maintaining informal credit accounts for small transactions, accepting payment in kind, eggs, butter, work, when exact cash payment is impossible. The woman selling apples at the market might accept a dozen different forms of payment, keeping mental track of the relative values, while her customers fumble through their mixed bags of coins and notes. Barter remains an important part of the economy, despite the increasing commercialization of colonial society. A farmer might pay his blacksmith in bushels of wheat, the wheat valued at current market prices but never actually converted to cash. A craftsman might trade his products for those of another craftsman, each valuing the exchange according to the going rates. These transactions are recorded in ledgers using pound sterling as the unit of account, even though no pounds actually change hands. It's a hybrid system that combines the precision of monetary accounting with the flexibility of direct exchange. Historians still argue about whether colonial monetary chaos held back economic development or was actually a creative adaptation to difficult circumstances. The shortage of official currency was a genuine constraint, but the various workarounds, paper money, foreign coins, credit networks, barter, allowed commerce to continue and even thrive. The colonists were effectively creating their own monetary system in the absence of adequate support from the mother country, a development that would have important implications when they later sought political independence as well. Credit, as mentioned earlier, is the grease that keeps this creaky system moving. Merchants extend credit to farmers until the harvest comes in. Retailers extend credit to consumers until payday. Everyone owes everyone else, in a web of obligations that binds the community together, even as it creates endless opportunities for dispute and default. The account books of colonial merchants are time capsules of economic life, recording not just what was bought and sold, but the entire network of financial relationships that made commerce possible. Interest on loans is technically limited by usury laws, but these laws are easily evaded through various devices. The practical interest rate, the cost of borrowing money, whether explicitly charged or hidden in inflated prices for credit purchases, varies considerably based on the borrower's reputation and the lender's assessment of risk. A well-connected merchant can borrow cheaply. A marginal farmer pays through the nose. The colonial credit system reinforces existing social hierarchies, while occasionally providing opportunities for entrepreneurial individuals to leverage borrowed money into real wealth. You reach into your pocket and examine the coins there, a mixture of Spanish, English, and miscellaneous pieces of metal that represent your immediate purchasing power. The arithmetic required to understand what you can actually buy is significant. That Spanish half-real, worn almost smooth from circulation, how does it compare to the Massachusetts bill that's been folded and refolded until the printing is nearly illegible? What would a shopkeeper accept, and at what valuation? This is why reputation matters so much in colonial commerce. In a system this complicated, with this many opportunities for misunderstanding or fraud, trust is the most valuable currency of all. If a merchant knows you, if your family has a history of honest dealing, if you're vouched for by someone the merchant trusts, then transactions become easier, credit becomes available, the rough edges of the monetary system smooth out. If you're a stranger, if your reputation is unknown or questionable, every transaction becomes a negotiation not just over price, but over basic trustworthiness. The monetary confusion will eventually be addressed, though not in ways that colonists of the 1750s would predict. The revolution will bring new currencies, new problems, and new solutions. The Constitution will give the federal government power over coinage while prohibiting state paper money. A national banking system will emerge, collapse, emerge again. The chaotic creativity of colonial money will give way to more orderly arrangements, though anyone following modern monetary policy debates might wonder if we've really made that much progress after all. The midday sun has climbed high enough that your shadow pools directly beneath your feet, and your stomach insists that breakfast was far too many hours ago. This is the dinner hour in colonial Boston, dinner being the main meal of the day, eaten in early to mid-afternoon when work can be interrupted and daylight still permits a proper gathering. And the place to experience this meal, if you're not heading home to family, is one of Boston's many taverns. These establishments are far more than drinking spots. They're community centres, information hubs, political meeting grounds, and the closest thing colonial America has to restaurants. You push open the heavy door of a tavern on a side street off King Street, and you're immediately enveloped in a warm, smoky, surprisingly welcoming atmosphere. The room is dim, windows are small and expensive, so natural light is limited, but several candles and the glow of a fireplace provide enough illumination to navigate. Wooden tables are scattered throughout, surrounded by benches and simple chairs, most of them occupied by men engaged in conversation, card games, or the serious business of eating and drinking. The smell is powerful. Wood smoke, roasting meat, spilled beer, pipe tobacco, and the accumulated essence of thousands of previous patrons. A tavern keeper approaches, wiping his hands on an apron that might once have been white. "What will you have?" The question seems simple, but the answer requires some understanding of what's actually available. For dinner, the tavern probably offers some kind of meat, perhaps a roast joint, perhaps a stew, perhaps whatever the kitchen managed to acquire that morning. There might be bread, cheese, vegetables if they're in season. The meal is served on a wooden trencher or pewter plate, eaten with your own knife, everyone carries a personal knife, and perhaps a spoon. Forks exist but are still considered somewhat effete. Real men eat with their hands and knife, thank you very much. The drink options are more extensive. Beer is the default, brewed locally in varying strengths from small beer to stronger ales. Cider is popular in New England, where apple orchards thrive and fermentation turns the harvest into a storable beverage. Rum, produced from Caribbean molasses in Boston's distilleries, packs a serious punch, and can be had straight or mixed with water, sugar, and citrus in various combinations. Wine is available for those with finer taste and deeper pockets, and flip, that distinctively colonial concoction of beer, rum, sugar, and beaten eggs, heated by plunging a red-hot poker into the mug, offers both nutrition and intoxication in one foaming, complicated drink. The quantity of alcohol consumed in colonial America would shock modern sensibilities. Drinking is not just accepted, it's expected, woven into the fabric of daily life. Workers drink at their benches. Farmers drink in their fields. Businessmen seal deals over drinks. Ministers drink. though they're expected to maintain moderation. Even children drink small beer. The average colonial adult consumes something like 7 gallons of alcohol per year, which is roughly 3 times the modern American rate. Public drunkenness is common enough that towns appoint tithing men, partly to monitor the taverns and discourage excessive consumption. Yet the colonial attitude toward alcohol is complicated. While drinking is normal, drunkenness that interferes with work or family obligations is condemned. The ideal is merry drinking that loosens inhibitions and bonds fellowship without leading to total incapacitation. The line between acceptable and unacceptable drinking is fluid, enforced more by social pressure than legal restriction, and different people draw it in different places. Some colonists abstain entirely for religious reasons. Others seem to have discovered the prototype of what we'd now call alcoholism. Here's something fascinating about tavern culture. These are democratic spaces in ways that few other colonial institutions are. In the tavern, men of different classes mingle, sharing tables and conversations that would be impossible in more formal settings. A merchant might find himself debating with a sailor, a master craftsman arguing with a labourer. The social hierarchies that define colonial life relax somewhat in the tavern's convivial atmosphere. This doesn't mean hierarchy disappears, wealth and status still matter, but the norms are different, the barriers lower. Historians still argue whether taverns were engines of democratic culture, or simply safety valves that allowed social tensions to dissipate harmlessly. Some scholars emphasize the political organizing that happened in taverns, the way radical ideas spread from table to table, the groundwork for revolution being laid over countless pints. Others note that tavern democracy had strict limits. Women were largely excluded, as were enslaved people and indigenous peoples, and the fellowship of the tap room didn't translate into actual political equality. Both perspectives capture something true about these complex institutions. The conversation around you is a mix of gossip, commerce, and politics. At one table, men discuss the arrival of a ship from London, what goods it carried, how prices might shift, who stands to profit or lose. At another, voices rise in argument about some local controversy, though you can't quite make out the details. Someone is reading aloud from a newspaper, the audience listening intently to news that's already weeks old by the time it reaches these shores. The tavern is information exchange, a place where news and rumour mix freely, and everyone tries to piece together an understanding of the wider world. The food arrives, and it's hearty if not sophisticated. A thick slice of roasted pork, bread that's been softened in the meat drippings, something that might be turnips boiled into submission. The flavours are simple: salt, fat, the slight char of meat roasted over an open fire, but your hungry body doesn't complain. You eat with the same knife you carry for all purposes, tearing bread with your hands, drinking beer that's darker and earthier than anything you'd find in a modern craft brewery. Portions in colonial taverns are generally generous. The culture prizes abundance, at least in public eating situations, and going hungry is a sign of poverty that carries real social stigma. A man who can't afford a proper dinner is a man whose credit is questionable, whose business dealings should perhaps be approached with caution. Eating well in public is a form of display, showing that your affairs are in order and your future is secure. This might be why colonial Americans gained a reputation for heartiness that distinguished them from their more abstemious European cousins. The tavern keeper circulates among the tables, refilling drinks, exchanging words with regulars, keeping an eye on the room's temperature, both literal and figurative. A good keeper knows when conversation is getting too heated, when to separate potential combatants, when to cut off someone who's had enough. The tavern is his living room, and he maintains it with a host's combination of hospitality and authority. Misbehave here, and you might find yourself unwelcome, forced to take your business to some lesser establishment. As you finish your meal and nurse your second beer, you notice a group in the corner engaged in what seems like particularly intense discussion. Papers are spread on the table. Voices are lowered conspiratorially. In 1750s Boston, this could be anything. A business partnership being formed, a legal case being discussed, or perhaps something more politically charged. The tensions between colony and crown that will eventually explode into revolution are already building, though most colonists don't yet imagine how far things will go. The tavern is also a place for games and entertainment. Dice and cards appear at several tables, though gambling is technically regulated and games are supposed to be for small stakes. A game of billiards might be happening in a back room if the tavern is prosperous enough to own a table. And there's always the entertainment of conversation itself. the sport of wit and argument that educated colonists cultivate as a mark of refinement. You settle your bill, a few pence for the food and drink, charged to your account if you're known here, or paid in whatever currency you can produce if you're not, and prepare to continue your day. The tavern has done its work. You're fed, you're slightly buzzed, you're caught up on local affairs, and you've participated in one of colonial Boston's central social rituals. The afternoon stretches ahead, full of work to be done and a world to navigate. You step out of the tavern into the afternoon light, and the first thing you notice is the sound of church bells. Again. Still. Always. The bells of Boston's churches are the heartbeat of the city, marking time, calling the faithful, announcing events, and reminding everyone constantly, inescapably, that religion is not optional in this community. You can no more escape the church in 1750s Boston than you can escape the air you breathe. It shapes everything: law, custom, family life, social standing, the very rhythm of your days. So let's talk about what it actually means to be religious in colonial New England. The Puritan founders of Massachusetts Bay arrived with a mission: to create a godly society, a city upon a hill that would demonstrate true Christian community to a corrupt world. By the 1750s, that original fervour has cooled somewhat. The strict theocracy of the founders has given way to a more commercially oriented society. But the structures they established remain powerful. Most adults are required by law to attend church services. Most children are catechized in religious principles. Most public discourse is framed in religious terms, and most social respectability depends on demonstrating appropriate piety. The congregational churches that dominate Massachusetts are descended from the Puritan movement that shaped English Protestantism. They believe in predestination, the idea that God has already chosen who will be saved and who will be damned, and human actions cannot change this divine decision. This might seem like a recipe for fatalism, but Puritans drew the opposite conclusion. Since you can't know for certain whether you're among the elect, you should live as if you are, demonstrating through righteous living the signs of God's grace. This produces a culture of constant moral self-examination, of trying to discern in your own life evidence of salvation or damnation. Church membership is not automatic. To become a full member of a congregational church, you must provide testimony of your conversion experience, a personal narrative of how you came to recognize God's grace in your life. This relation is examined by church elders, who determine whether your experience is genuine enough to merit admission. The process is intimidating and exclusive. Many attend church for years without ever achieving full membership. It's a spiritual gatekeeping that creates hierarchies within the congregation: full members who can vote on church matters, halfway members with partial standing, and mere attenders who lack any formal status. The minister, the pastor of your congregation, is one of the most important figures in colonial society. He's educated, often Harvard-trained, familiar with ancient languages and theological debates that most parishioners cannot follow. He preaches every Sunday, and often on weekday lecture days as well, explaining scripture, exhorting moral behaviour, connecting the daily lives of his congregation to the cosmic drama of salvation and damnation. A powerful preacher can move his listeners to tears, to spiritual crisis, to transformation. A boring one can empty a meeting house faster than a fire alarm. Here's something that might surprise you. The 1750s are a moment of religious upheaval in colonial America. The Great Awakening, that wave of evangelical revival that swept through the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s, has left deep divisions. Preachers like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, famous for his sermon Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, have challenged established churches, emphasizing emotional conversion experiences over formal theology. Some congregations split between old lights, who preferred traditional worship, and new lights, who embraced revivalist enthusiasm. These divisions are still fresh and sometimes bitter. Historians still argue about the significance of the Great Awakening. Some see it as a democratizing force, empowering ordinary believers to challenge clerical authority and setting the stage for revolutionary politics. Others emphasize the conservative aspects of revivalism, its reinforcement of submission to divine and social order. The truth is probably that the awakening meant different things to different people at different times. A reminder that religious movements are complex and resist simple characterization. Sunday in colonial Boston begins early and lasts long. The Sabbath is taken seriously here. Work is prohibited. Travel is restricted, and the entire day is devoted to religious observance. The morning service might begin at 9 or 10 and continue for 3 hours or more, with lengthy sermons that test even the devout. There's a break for the midday meal, then the afternoon service continues the instruction. Families sit together in pews that are assigned by social rank. The wealthiest and most prominent families near the front, the poor and enslaved at the back or in galleries. Even in worship, hierarchy is visible and reinforced. The meeting house itself is a plain structure, reflecting Puritan rejection of elaborate religious art and architecture. No stained glass, no statues of saints, no ornate altars, just wooden benches, a simple pulpit, and the central focus on the preached word. The absence of decoration is itself a statement. True worship comes from the heart, not from sensory manipulation. The stark walls and hard benches are meant to keep the congregation focused on spiritual matters, not distracted by worldly beauty. Not everyone in Boston is Congregationalist, of course. Anglicans, members of the Church of England, worship at King's Chapel, maintaining the liturgical traditions that Puritans rejected. Vestments, prayer books, a more formal service. Baptists, Quakers, and other dissenting groups exist on the margins, sometimes tolerated and sometimes persecuted. The religious diversity of colonial America is growing, and even Puritan Boston cannot maintain the uniformity its founders imagined. But Congregationalism remains dominant, and belonging to the established church confers social advantages that dissenters cannot access. Your religious life is public business in colonial Boston. Church attendance is monitored, absences are noted, and persistent non-attendance can result in fines or more serious consequences. Your neighbours watch whether you keep the Sabbath properly, whether your family observes family worship, whether your behaviour reflects appropriate moral standards. The community has a vested interest in your spiritual state, because sin in one person can bring God's judgment on all. This mutual surveillance might feel oppressive to modern sensibilities, but colonists understood it as loving concern for souls in danger of damnation. The connection between religious and civic life is intimate. Ministers give election sermons, praying over and advising political leaders. Laws are justified in religious terms. Community morality is enforced through both secular and ecclesiastical mechanisms. To be a good citizen is to be a good Christian. The two identities are inseparable. This doesn't mean everyone is genuinely pious. Human nature being what it is, plenty of colonists go through the motions while harbouring private doubts or moral failings. But the public performance of religion is required, whatever private thoughts might lurk beneath. As you walk past one of Boston's churches, you might notice people entering for a weekday lecture or prayer meeting. Religion in colonial America isn't confined to Sunday. It permeates the week through various observances, fast days, Thanksgiving days, and the ongoing rhythm of family worship. The minister might visit homes, checking on the spiritual health of his flock. Religious education continues for children and servants. Books of sermons and devotional literature are among the most common printed materials. To live in colonial Boston is to live in a world saturated with religious language, imagery, and expectation. This might sound exhausting, and in some ways it is, but religion also provides community, meaning, comfort in times of suffering, and a framework for understanding life's big questions. When your child dies, and many children will, religion offers the hope of reunion in heaven. When business fails or harvest falls short, religion explains that God is testing your faith. When injustice goes unpunished in this world, religion promises divine judgment in the next. The costs of religious observance come with genuine benefits that help explain why people accept them. The church bells fade into the general city noise, and you find yourself near a modest building that a sign identifies as a school. Not a school as you'd recognise it. No sprawling campus, no gymnasium, no cafeteria, just a single room where children of various ages are being drilled in the fundamentals of literacy and arithmetic. Education in colonial Boston is valued, but it's neither universal nor equal. Who gets educated, how much education they receive, and what they learn are all determined by factors of class, gender, and family circumstance. Let's explore what it means to be educated or uneducated in 1750s New England. Massachusetts has a particular claim to educational pride. The colony established the first public school in British North America, Boston Latin School, in 1635, and the first college, Harvard, in 1636. and it passed laws requiring towns to maintain schools long before such requirements existed in other colonies. This commitment reflects the Puritan emphasis on Bible literacy. If everyone must read scripture to find salvation, then everyone must learn to read. The result is literacy rates in New England that exceed those of the mother country, particularly among men. But education covers a wide spectrum of experiences. At the bottom is the dame school, typically run by a woman out of her home, teaching young children, both boys and girls, basic reading, perhaps writing, perhaps simple arithmetic. The dame school is the first formal education most colonial children receive, and for many girls it's also the last. The curriculum is rudimentary. The alphabet, simple words, perhaps some catechism questions. The teaching methods rely heavily on memorization and recitation, with the birch rod available for students who fail to apply themselves. Now, boys who show promise might proceed to a grammar school, like the Boston Latin School you pass on your walk. Grammar schools prepare students for college, which means their curriculum focuses on classical languages, Latin primarily with some Greek. The name grammar school refers specifically to Latin grammar. If you can't pass a Latin sentence, you can't study at Harvard. These schools are demanding, with long hours of drilling in languages that students will need for the rest of their academic careers. They're also relatively exclusive, serving families who can spare their sons from labour and afford the fees. Harvard College sits a few miles away in Cambridge, training young men for the ministry, law, and other learned professions. The college curriculum continues the classical emphasis: Latin, Greek, Hebrew, philosophy, theology, and rhetoric. Students are expected to converse in Latin, debate in Latin, write their theses in Latin. The classical world is considered the foundation of all serious learning, and a Harvard graduate emerges steeped in Cicero, Aristotle, and the Church Fathers. Practical subjects like science or commerce receive less attention. Those are for people who actually need to work for a living. Here's something that might surprise you about colonial education. Corporal punishment is considered essential pedagogy. Spare the rod and spoil the child is not just a proverb, it's educational philosophy. Teachers are expected to beat students who fail to learn or who misbehave, and the only question is the appropriate severity and frequency of these beatings. Some masters are relatively gentle, others are notorious for cruelty. Parents generally support this discipline, believing that children's natural sinfulness requires forceful correction. The idea that learning should be enjoyable, that students should be intrinsically motivated, that physical punishment might actually impede education. These would seem bizarre to most colonists. Historians still argue about actual literacy rates in colonial New England. The common claim that Puritan culture produced near-universal male literacy is probably overstated. Many men could sign their names but struggled with extended reading. Female literacy lagged considerably behind male, though it was higher in New England than in other colonies, or in England itself. Literacy itself is a slippery concept. Reading and writing were often taught as separate skills, and someone might be able to read simple texts without being able to write anything beyond their signature. The sources available make precise measurement difficult, and scholars continue to refine their estimates. For girls, educational opportunities are severely limited. A girl might attend dame school, learning enough reading to study the Bible, and perhaps enough writing to keep household accounts. But higher education, grammar school, college, is completely closed to women. The assumption is that women don't need classical languages or theological disputation. They need practical skills for managing households and raising children. Domestic education, learning to cook, sew, preserve food, manage servants, raise children, is provided informally, passed from mothers and older women to daughters and younger women through daily practice. This doesn't mean women are uneducated. Many colonial women are remarkably accomplished within the spheres available to them. They read widely, discuss ideas with educated husbands, correspond with friends and family in letters that demonstrate sharp intelligence and clear expression. But their education is self-directed, acquired in the gaps between domestic duties, never recognised with formal credentials. A woman who would have thrived at Harvard must content herself with whatever learning she can piece together from borrowed books and overheard conversations. Apprenticeship, as we discussed earlier, is another form of education, practical rather than classical, focused on specific trades rather than general cultivation. An apprentice learns by doing, under the supervision of a master who transmits skills accumulated over generations. This is education in the original sense, leading a young person out of ignorance into competence. It lacks the prestige of formal schooling, but may be more immediately useful in a world where most people earn their living through physical skill rather than book learning. The schoolroom you're observing is somewhere in the middle of this educational hierarchy. It's a writing school, teaching practical literacy to boys whose families want them literate, but don't aspire to send them to Harvard. The curriculum includes reading, in English not Latin, writing, a useful skill for commerce, and arithmetic, essential for any business. These schools prepare students for careers as merchants, tradesmen, or clerks, respectable positions that require education without requiring classical learning. The children you can see through the window range in age from perhaps 6 to 12, sitting on wooden benches hunched over slates or copybooks. The master stands at the front, pointer in hand, drilling them in whatever subject currently occupies his attention. There's no colourful decoration, no educational toys, no individual learning plans. Education in this era is one-size-fits-all, transmitted through memorization and reinforced through fear of punishment. Students who learn quickly sit alongside those who struggle, all receiving the same instruction at the same pace. Books are precious and expensive. The school might own a few shared texts, a Bible certainly, probably a primer for beginning readers, perhaps a horn book, paddle-shaped board covered with a printed sheet protected by translucent horn. Students copy passages laboriously, learning penmanship and content simultaneously. The scarcity of materials shapes pedagogy. Without textbooks for every student, education must rely on oral instruction and memorization. Learning in this context often means being able to recite. Students demonstrate knowledge by reproducing texts they've committed to memory. But despite all these limitations, something remarkable is happening in colonial New England. A significant portion of the population can read. Ideas spread through printed pamphlets and newspapers. Ordinary people participate in theological debates, political arguments, legal disputes. The Puritan investment in literacy, however imperfectly realized, has created a populace more educated than most in the Atlantic world. This educated populace will prove important when the time comes to argue about rights, representation and revolution. Your walk has taken you past the school, and toward a neighbourhood where the buildings seem a bit less prosperous, the streets a bit less maintained. And here, on a weathered sign, you notice the symbol of an apothecary, the mortar and pestle that marks a purveyor of medicines and medical care. You pause, remembering the hasty pudding sitting uneasily in your stomach, and consider the terrifying question: what happens if you get sick in 1750s Boston? The answer is sobering enough to make that uneasy stomach feel like a minor blessing. Medicine in the colonial era is, to put it generously, still developing. The germ theory of disease won't be established for another century. Doctors in the 1750s still operate on the humoral theory inherited from ancient Greece, believing that health depends on the balance of 4 bodily humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness results from imbalance, and treatment aims to restore equilibrium through methods that often seem designed to kill the patient faster than the disease. Bloodletting is the go-to treatment for almost everything. Fever? Drain some blood. Inflammation? Drain some blood. Headache? Believe it or not, drain some blood. The theory is that removing blood reduces excess humours and relieves pressure on inflamed systems. In practice, weakening a sick person by reducing their blood volume tends to make things worse. George Washington will eventually die partially due to aggressive bloodletting for a throat infection, and countless colonists meet similar fates at the hands of well-meaning but misguided physicians. Purging is another favourite. This can go in either direction: emetics to induce vomiting, cathartics to induce diarrhoea, with the goal of expelling corrupt humours from the system. The medications used are often heroic in their severity. A typical purge might leave the patient cramping, sweating, and wishing for death, which doctors interpret as evidence that the treatment is working. The violence of the body's reaction is proof of the disease being expelled. That it also expels essential fluids and electrolytes, leaving the patient dehydrated and weaker, is not yet understood. Blistering involves applying irritating substances to the skin to raise blisters, drawing bad humours to the surface where they can be drained. Mercury is administered for all sorts of conditions, particularly venereal diseases, despite the fact that mercury poisoning produces symptoms nearly as bad as the diseases it supposedly treats. Opium provides relief from pain, but creates its own dependencies. Alcohol is prescribed liberally, sometimes as the primary treatment, sometimes to make other treatments more bearable. The colonial pharmacy is a cabinet of horrors that makes modern medicine seem like miraculous magic. Here's a quirky and disturbing fact. One popular treatment for various conditions involves applying live leeches to the patient's body. The leeches suck blood, providing a more controlled form of bloodletting that some practitioners prefer. Patients might have dozens of leeches attached, each wriggling black body drawing out what the doctor believes to be corrupt blood. This is not fringe medicine, it's mainstream practice, recommended by respected physicians on both sides of the Atlantic. The leech trade is a real industry, supplying medical demand that won't diminish for another century. Physicians themselves occupy a strange position in colonial society. There's no licensing requirement, no medical school in America, the first won't open until 1765, and no real standardization of training. Some physicians have studied in Edinburgh or London, returning with the best available education in theories that happen to be wrong. Others have learned through apprenticeship to establish practitioners, inheriting both useful techniques and harmful traditions. Still others have simply declared themselves doctors, learning on the job while their patients suffer the consequences. Anyone can hang out a shingle. Distinguishing competent from incompetent practitioners is largely a matter of reputation and luck. Historians still argue about whether colonial medicine actually helped or harmed on balance. The heroic treatments, bloodletting, purging, mercury, almost certainly did more harm than good. But physicians also provided comfort, company, and the psychological benefit of feeling that something was being done. They set bones, drained abscesses, assisted difficult childbirths, though this was more commonly midwives' work, and occasionally stumbled onto treatments that actually worked. The fact that sick people continued consulting physicians despite the brutal treatment suggests that the alternatives, suffering alone, consulting unlicensed quacks, or relying entirely on folk remedies, seemed even worse. Epidemic disease is the great terror of colonial life. Smallpox sweeps through periodically, killing or disfiguring a significant percentage of those it infects. The Boston smallpox epidemic of 1721 was a turning point, Cotton Mather, and Zabdiel Boylston championed inoculation, a risky procedure that involved deliberately infecting healthy people with a mild case to prevent worse infection later. The method worked, but it was controversial. Many believed that deliberately spreading disease was impious, and the procedure itself killed about 2% of those inoculated. By the 1750s, inoculation is more accepted, though still debated. Other diseases stalk the population: measles, diphtheria, dysentery, typhoid fever, typhus, influenza, and countless others that we now prevent or easily treat. Infant mortality is staggering. Perhaps 1 in 5 children dies before reaching their first birthday, and another significant portion dies before age 10. Women face particular dangers in childbirth, with maternal mortality rates that would constitute a crisis by modern standards. Life expectancy at birth hovers around 40 years, though this number is dragged down by infant mortality. If you survive childhood, you have a decent chance of reaching 60 or beyond. The apothecary shop you're examining displays jars of mysterious substances, some of which might actually help and most of which definitely won't. Herbal remedies offer gentle alternatives to heroic medicine, though their effectiveness varies widely. Willow bark contains something like aspirin and actually reduces fever and pain. Cinchona bark, quinine, treats malaria. But for every remedy that works, there are dozens that do nothing or cause harm, and distinguishing between them requires trial and error that patients may not survive. Dental care deserves special mention in this catalogue of horrors. Toothache is common given the state of colonial oral hygiene, and the treatment is simple: extraction. There's no Novocaine, no laughing gas, no gentle modern techniques. The barber, who doubles as surgeon, grabs the offending tooth with iron forceps and yanks it out while the patient screams. Infection following extraction is common. Death from dental infection is not unheard of. People learn to live with toothaches as long as possible, knowing that the cure might be worse than the disease. Mental illness exists but is poorly understood and poorly treated. The mentally ill might be kept at home by family, chained in cellars if their behaviour becomes dangerous. They might be confined to almshouses alongside the poor and physically disabled. The most troublesome might be jailed. Treatment, such as it exists, aims at control rather than cure. The idea that mental illness might have treatable causes is still emerging, and the conditions in which the mentally ill live would constitute torture by modern standards. Walking away from the apothecary shop, you find yourself profoundly grateful for modern medicine. The advances of the last century have been so complete that it's easy to forget how recently humans lived at the mercy of diseases we now prevent with vaccines, treat with antibiotics, or manage with drugs that colonial physicians couldn't have imagined. Every person in 1750s Boston lives with the knowledge that illness could strike at any time, and that when it does, the available treatments might make things worse. It's a shadow over daily life that modern health security has, for many of us, lifted. The afternoon shadows are lengthening as you continue through Boston's streets, and you begin to notice something that might have escaped attention earlier. The profound differences in how men and women move through this world. The man walking briskly to a business appointment, the woman carrying a basket of laundry, the girl shepherding younger children home from an errand. Each occupies a different position in colonial society, with different rights, different responsibilities, and different expectations shaping every moment of their lives. Let's pause and consider what daily life looks like from a woman's perspective in 1750s Boston. The legal position of women in colonial America is defined by a doctrine called coverture. Upon marriage, a woman's legal identity is absorbed into her husband's. She literally becomes covered by him in the eyes of the law. This means married women cannot own property in their own names, cannot enter into contracts, cannot sue or be sued, and have no legal claim to their own earnings. The husband controls everything, including property the wife brought into the marriage. A married woman is, in legal terms, almost invisible. This isn't as absolute as it sounds in practice. Colonial courts sometimes protect women's interests, and many couples arrange their affairs to give wives practical control over household matters even without legal recognition. Prenuptial agreements occasionally protect wealthy women's property, and widows enjoy more legal independence than wives. They can own property, run businesses, and appear in court in their own right. But the basic structure is clear. Marriage means surrendering legal personhood, and most women spend most of their adult lives under this limitation. The daily labour of women is relentless. Wake before dawn to restart the fire, prepare breakfast, tend to young children who need constant supervision, haul water from the well, heat water for washing, wash clothes by hand, a back-breaking process of scrubbing, wringing and drying that occupies an entire day each week. Spin thread from flax or wool, weave cloth, sew and mend garments for the entire family, preserve food through smoking, salting, drying and pickling, make soap from animal fat and lye, make candles for light, tend the garden, care for poultry and perhaps a cow, cook dinner, scrub dishes, prepare supper, manage servants or apprentices if the household has them, put children to bed, fall exhausted into your own bed, knowing tomorrow will be exactly the same. This labour is economically essential but socially undervalued. The household goods that women produce, the cloth, the candles, the preserved food, have real market value. A woman's portion in managing domestic production contributes significantly to family prosperity. But because this work happens within the home rather than the public marketplace, it receives less recognition than men's work outside the household. The division between productive male labour and reproductive female labour begins here, with consequences that persist for centuries. Here's something that might surprise you. Colonial women are expected to be spiritually subordinate, as well as legally and economically subordinate. The dominant religious teaching holds that women are more susceptible to sin, Eve's legacy, requiring male guidance to stay on the path of righteousness. A wife should submit to her husband as the church submits to Christ. This is literal biblical instruction, preached regularly and taken seriously. Women who step outside their assigned roles, speaking publicly, challenging male authority, expressing independent theological opinions, face serious consequences ranging from social ostracism to legal punishment. Yet within these constraints, colonial women exercise real influence. The household is her domain, and domestic decisions, what to buy, what to make, how to allocate resources, rest largely with the wife. Children's early education happens under female supervision, shaping minds before formal schooling begins. Women's networks of kinship and friendship provide crucial social support, sharing information, resources, and assistance in times of need. The formal power structures may be entirely male, but the informal power structures that make daily life possible depend heavily on women's labour and management. Childbearing is the great biological fact of colonial women's lives. Birth control is primitive and unreliable. Most married women spend much of their reproductive years either pregnant or nursing. A typical colonial mother might have 6 to 8 children, though only half might survive to adulthood. Each pregnancy carries significant risk. Perhaps 1 in 50 or 1 in 30 childbirths results in the mother's death, and complications that modern obstetrics could easily handle often prove fatal. Childbirth is women's work, attended by midwives and neighbouring women, with male physicians called only in emergencies, and often making things worse when they arrive. Historians still argue about whether colonial women were oppressed victims of patriarchy, or active agents making meaningful lives within their constraints. Both perspectives capture something true. The legal disabilities were real. The labour was crushing. The dangers were constant. But colonial women were not passive. They bargained, they manoeuvred, they found ways to exercise influence and pursue their interests within the system. Reducing them to victims ignores their agency. Ignoring the system's injustice romanticizes their situation. Women's clothing, which we touched on earlier, deserves additional attention here. The stays, petticoats and gowns that respectable women wear are not just fashion. They're statements about status, modesty and proper womanhood. Getting dressed requires time, assistance and attention that male clothing doesn't demand. The physical restriction of stays, the weight and heat of multiple petticoats, the impracticality of long skirts for vigorous work, these shape what women can and cannot do. Working class women might wear simpler versions, but even simplified female clothing is more cumbersome than male equivalent. Unmarried women occupy an awkward position. They have somewhat more legal standing than married women. They can own property and enter contracts, but they face intense social pressure to marry. A woman who remains single past her mid-20s is viewed with suspicion. Why hasn't anyone wanted her? Is something wrong with her character, her appearance, her family? The spinster, originally a neutral term for a woman who spins thread, becomes a figure of pity or mockery, existing in the margins of a society organised around married households. Widows present a different case. A woman who survives her husband inherits a portion of his estate, typically 1/3 by law, and gains the legal independence of an unmarried woman. Some widows thrive, running businesses and managing property with skills developed during marriage but never previously recognised. Others struggle, particularly if the husband left debts or if the widow lacks marketable skills. Remarriage is common, returning the widow to the legal invisibility of coverture but providing economic security and social standing. You watch a woman walking home with heavy baskets, children trailing behind, and you try to imagine her day. Up before dawn, in bed after dark, every waking hour filled with labour that barely keeps a household functioning. No days off, no retirement, no acknowledgement that this work is work. The next time you feel overwhelmed by your modern obligations, remember her, carrying burdens we can barely imagine, while being told that her contribution doesn't really count. The children following that woman catch your attention, and you realise that we need to talk about childhood in colonial Boston. If you're imagining little innocents playing with toys, attending school and being sheltered from adult concerns, you're imagining a version of childhood that won't exist for another century. Colonial children are not miniature adults exactly. The idea that they have distinct needs and developmental stages is emerging, but they're much closer to adult responsibilities than modern children are. Let's explore what it means to be young in the 1750s. The first challenge is simply surviving. As we discussed earlier, infant mortality is devastating. Perhaps 1 in 5 babies dies before their first birthday, and the losses continue through childhood. Diseases that we now prevent with vaccines or treat with antibiotics cut through colonial families with terrible regularity. A mother who raises even half her children to adulthood is doing well by the standards of the time. This constant presence of death shapes everything about colonial childhood: the anxiety of parents, the religious instruction emphasising eternal life, the practical expectation that not all children will survive. The children you see on Boston streets are dressed differently than you might expect. There's no children's clothing in the modern sense. Kids wear smaller versions of adult garments. Boys and girls alike wear long dresses called coats until around age 6 or 7, when boys are breeched, given their first pair of breeches in a ceremony that marks their transition toward male identity. Girls continue in similar clothing to their mothers, learning through daily practice the management of stays, petticoats, and skirts that will define their adult lives. Children are expected to work as soon as they're capable of useful labour. Even quite young children, 4 or 5, can be set to simple tasks: gathering eggs, feeding chickens, carrying messages, watching younger siblings. As they grow, the tasks become more demanding. A 7-year-old girl might be spinning thread. A 10-year-old boy might be assisting in his father's workshop. The formal apprenticeships that bind teenagers to masters are simply the culmination of a childhood spent preparing for productive adult labour. The idea that children should be protected from work, that play is their job, would seem dangerously indulgent to colonial parents. Here's something that might seem harsh by modern standards. Colonial children are not generally at the centre of family life. The notion that children's needs should shape household decisions, that parenting should focus on fostering individual development, that each child is a unique flower to be nurtured, these are later innovations. Colonial parents love their children, certainly, but that love expresses itself in preparing children for adult responsibilities, not in indulging their preferences or protecting them from difficulty. The goal of childhood is to become a competent adult as quickly as possible. Discipline is correspondingly severe. Remember, spare the rod and spoil the child. This applies at home as much as at school. Physical punishment for misbehaviour is standard, expected and approved by religious and secular authorities alike. The theory is that children are born with sinful natures that must be broken through firm correction. A child who talks back, who disobeys, who shows willful independence, is manifesting the depravity that all humans inherit from Adam, and the loving parental response is to beat it out of them. This sounds brutal because it is brutal, but colonists understood it as necessary kindness. Historians still argue about whether childhood as we understand it existed in colonial America. Some scholars emphasize continuities. Parents loved children, recognized their vulnerability, sought to protect them, that suggest a recognizable, if harsher version of modern childhood. Others emphasize the differences: early labour, severe discipline, high mortality accepted as normal, that suggest something fundamentally different from contemporary experience. As with many historical debates, the answer depends partly on which aspects of childhood you emphasize and how you define your terms. Toys exist, but they're simpler and rarer than modern equivalents. A doll might be a corncob wrapped in cloth. A ball might be an inflated pig's bladder. Marbles, hoops, spinning tops, simple card games, music, storytelling. These provide entertainment when there's time for entertainment. But playtime is not a protected category in colonial childhood. Play happens in the gaps between work, when tasks are completed and daylight remains, not as a structured part of each day. Children's literature is almost entirely religious or didactic. The New England Primer, the most common school book, uses rhyming couplets to teach the alphabet. In Adam's fall, we sinned all for a, and so on through verses emphasizing mortality, sin and salvation. The message is clear. Children must learn not just to read, but to prepare their souls for death, which might come at any moment. The first illustrated children's book designed primarily for entertainment won't appear until 1744, John Newbery's A Little Pretty Pocket-Book, and it's still novel enough in the 1750s that most colonial children never see it. The transition from childhood to adulthood happens earlier and more gradually than in modern society. There's no clear moment of becoming an adult, no 18th birthday, no high school graduation. Instead, responsibility increases incrementally, and by their mid-teens, many young people are living away from home as apprentices, servants, or, for girls, working in other households to earn their portion for marriage. A 14-year-old in colonial Boston has far more adult responsibilities than a 14-year-old today, and a 17-year-old might be running a household or managing a business. The children you're watching now are likely navigating this challenging world with the resilience that children have always shown. They don't know that life could be different, that childhood could be easier, that the risks they face are not inevitable. They play when they can, work when they must, learn what their society teaches them, and prepare for adult lives that will probably look much like their parents. The revolutionary changes that will sweep through their world, political, industrial, cultural, are still beyond the horizon. For now, they're just kids, doing kid things in a time and place that makes modern childhood look like an impossible fantasy. And yet, something of modern childhood sensibility is beginning to emerge. Philosophers like John Locke are arguing that children are blank slates, shaped by experience and environment rather than born with fixed natures. Some parents are experimenting with gentler approaches, reasoning with children rather than simply commanding. The recognition that childhood is a distinct phase of life, requiring distinct treatment, is growing. The colonial children you see are living at a transition point between the harsh childhood of earlier centuries and the protected childhood that will gradually develop in later ones. You've been walking through colonial Boston for hours now, and perhaps you've noticed something that modern eyes might at first overlook. Not everyone on these streets is free. Among the servants, the sailors, the craftsmen and the merchants walk enslaved people. Black men, women and children who are legally property, bought and sold like livestock, their labour extracted under threat of violence. This is the uncomfortable truth about 1750s Boston. Slavery exists here, in the heart of what will later claim to be freedom's cradle, and it shapes the city's economy, society, and daily life in ways we cannot ignore. The mythology of northern innocence in American slavery is exactly that, mythology. Massachusetts Bay Colony legalized slavery in 1641, making it the first British colony in North America to do so explicitly. By the 1750s, enslaved people constitute roughly 10% of Boston's population, perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 souls, in a city of roughly 16,000. They work as household servants, dock workers, artisan assistants, sailors, and labourers of all kinds. Their presence is so common that colonists barely remark on it. Slavery is simply part of the social fabric. The experience of enslavement in Boston differs from the plantation slavery of the southern colonies in important ways, though not in ways that make it less than slavery. Enslaved people in Boston typically live in closer proximity to their enslavers, often in the same house, sometimes sleeping in the same room as the children they care for or near the workshops where they labour. This intimacy does not indicate kindness. It creates constant surveillance and eliminates even the small privacies that might exist in plantation quarters. An enslaved person in Boston is never out of their enslaver's sight. The work is varied but relentless. An enslaved woman might cook, clean, wash, sew, tend children, and perform countless other domestic tasks from before dawn until after dark. An enslaved man might assist in his master's trade, haul goods at the docks, tend horses, run errands, and provide whatever labour the household requires. Some enslaved people develop skilled trades, working as coopers, blacksmiths, or in other crafts, though the profits of their skilled labour belong to their enslavers. A few are even hired out to other employers, their wages collected by the people who own them. Here's something that might surprise you. Enslaved people in colonial Boston have some legal protections that don't exist in other colonies. Massachusetts law technically requires enslavers to provide adequate food, clothing and shelter. Extreme cruelty can, in theory, be prosecuted. Enslaved people can testify in court, own limited personal property, and even file lawsuits in some circumstances. These rights are not generously interpreted or consistently enforced, but they exist, creating a slightly different legal environment than the Deep South's later slave codes, which will strip enslaved people of virtually all legal personhood. But let's be absolutely clear, these differences do not make Boston's slavery benign. Human beings are still bought and sold. Families are separated at their enslaver's whim. Physical punishment, including whipping, is legal and common. Enslaved women have no protection against rape by their enslavers or other white men. The fundamental violence of treating people as property pervades every interaction, every relationship, every moment of enslaved people's lives. Any notion that northern slavery was somehow gentler is a fiction that serves to excuse northern complicity in the institution. Historians still argue about the nature and extent of slavery in colonial New England. Some emphasize the relatively small numbers compared to southern colonies, the urban context that created different dynamics, the legal protections that suggest a somewhat less absolutist version of the institution. Others argue that focusing on these differences downplays the essential brutality of slavery in any form and lets northern colonies off the hook for their participation in a system of human commodification. Both perspectives have merit, but neither should be used to minimize the lived experience of the enslaved. The enslaved people you see on Boston streets have typically arrived through the Atlantic slave trade, or been born into slavery in the colonies. Ships from Africa occasionally dock in Boston, though the city is not a major slave trading port like Charleston or Newport. More commonly, enslaved people are purchased from merchants who import them from the Caribbean or other colonies. already seasoned through the brutal process of adjustment that kills so many newly enslaved Africans. These people have survived the Middle Passage, the Caribbean breaking grounds, and the further trauma of second or third sail, carrying experiences of horror that they may never be able to speak. The communities that enslaved people build despite their circumstances are remarkable. Despite living scattered in different households, Boston's black population maintains connections through churches, including the first black church in North America, founded in Boston in 1805, through holiday gatherings that enslavers permit or fail to prevent, through networks of kinship, both biological and chosen. West African cultural practices survive, adapted to New England conditions, music, dance, religious beliefs, ways of understanding the world that enslavers cannot entirely suppress. Resistance takes many forms: work slowdowns, feigned ignorance, preservation of identity, running away, and occasionally open rebellion. Some enslaved people in Boston do achieve freedom, though the path is narrow and uncertain. A master might grant freedom in his will, manumission, particularly for enslaved people who have served long and faithfully, or unspoken, who are the enslaver's own children by an enslaved woman. Some enslaved people accumulate enough money, through tips or side work, to purchase their own freedom or that of family members. Others run away, disappearing into the larger population of free blacks in northern cities, or fleeing to areas where slavery is less established. Free black Bostonians exist, though in smaller numbers than the enslaved. They work as sailors, labourers, domestics, and in various trades, occupying the lowest rungs of a society that discriminates against them at every turn. They cannot vote, cannot testify against whites in most circumstances, face restrictions on where they can live and what jobs they can hold. Freedom is vastly preferable to slavery, but it doesn't mean equality. The colour line cuts through colonial Boston, defining opportunities and limitations regardless of legal status. As you watch enslaved people moving through the streets, carrying burdens, running errands, attending to their enslavers' needs, try to remember that each is an individual with an inner life as rich as your own. They have dreams, fears, loves, griefs, memories of places they may never see again, hopes for futures they may never achieve. The dehumanization of slavery depends on forgetting this, on seeing only the labour and not the person. Refusing that forgetting is one small act of witness we can still perform across the centuries. Slavery is not the only form of unfree labour in colonial Boston. Walking alongside the enslaved are indentured servants, white men, women and children, who have traded years of their lives for passage to America or other considerations. Their situation is different from slavery in important ways, but it's also far from the freedom we might assume they enjoy. Let's explore this in-between status, where people are neither fully free nor quite property. Indentured servitude works like this. Someone wants to come to America but can't afford the passage, which might cost as much as a working person could earn in several years. They sign a contract, an indenture, promising to work for a term of years, typically 4 to 7, in exchange for having their passage paid. Upon arrival, this contract is sold to a colonial employer, who receives the servant's labour for the contracted term. At the end, the servant is free, perhaps with some small payment or provisions to help them get started. It sounds almost reasonable until you examine the details. The experience of indentured servants varies enormously depending on their master, their contract terms, and their personal circumstances. Some servants end up in households that treat them almost like family, working hard but fairly compensated with decent food, clothing and training that prepares them for independent life. Others find themselves in situations of brutal exploitation, worked to the point of injury or death, physically abused, denied the basic necessities their contracts promise. The servant's recourse, complaining to local authorities, is uncertain at best, since those authorities are usually sympathetic to masters rather than servants. Here's a fact that might surprise you. Servants cannot quit. The contract binds them regardless of how bad conditions become, and running away is a crime. Colonial newspapers regularly carry advertisements for runaway servants, just like advertisements for runaway slaves, offering rewards for their capture and return. A servant who runs away and is caught faces extension of their term, perhaps double the time absent, plus punishment for the crime of absconding. The law treats the servant's labour as property belonging to the master, even though the servant themselves is not exactly property. Women servants face particular vulnerabilities. Sexual exploitation by masters is common, and a pregnant servant faces serious consequences. She cannot marry without her master's consent, and bearing a child outside marriage brings both moral condemnation and practical problems. The time she misses during pregnancy and childbirth is added to her term of service. She's essentially punished for being exploited. Her child might be bound out as a servant, the cycle continuing into the next generation. The power imbalance between master and female servant makes consent a questionable concept in any sexual relationship. The people who become indentured servants come from various backgrounds. Many are poor English, Irish, or German immigrants who see servitude as the only route to America. Others are convicts, transported to the colonies as an alternative to execution. The British regularly use transportation as a punishment, and colonial employers are happy to receive cheap labour regardless of its source. Still others are children, bound out by parents who cannot afford to support them, by parishes trying to reduce their poor relief expenses, or by colonial authorities dealing with orphans and abandoned children. Historians still argue about how to characterise indentured servitude. Is it a form of unfreedom essentially similar to slavery, differing only in degree and duration? Or is it fundamentally different because it's voluntary, at least in theory, temporary, and leads to genuine freedom at its conclusion? The debate touches on deep questions about what freedom means, whether contracts made under economic duress are truly voluntary, and how we should understand labour relationships that don't fit neatly into free/unfree categories. The end of servitude brings theoretical freedom but uncertain prospects. A servant whose term is complete receives whatever the contract specifies, perhaps a small payment, perhaps tools for a trade, perhaps just the clothes on their back. They enter the labour market competing with free workers, established craftsmen, and other recently freed servants. Success is possible. Plenty of former servants have risen to prosperity in colonial America. But failure is common too, and the years of servitude mean starting adult life later, without the family connections and accumulated resources that others enjoy. You see a young man in rough clothing carrying a heavy load through the streets, supervised by an older man who's clearly his master. Is he a servant, an apprentice, a slave? Without knowing more, it's impossible to tell. The visual markers of unfreedom are not always clear, and people in various states of legal subordination work side by side in colonial Boston. The free labour market that capitalism will eventually celebrate is still in formation, mixed with older forms of bound labour that won't disappear for decades. Children are particularly vulnerable to this system. Poor children, orphaned children, children whose parents have died or abandoned them, all might find themselves bound out as servants for terms extending to their majority, age 21 for boys, 18 for girls. This isn't always bad. A kind master might provide a child with training, stability and opportunity they couldn't otherwise access. But it's also not the child's choice, and abusive situations are tragically common. The protection that childhood theoretically offers is thin indeed when economic necessity intervenes. The presence of indentured servitude alongside slavery in colonial Boston raises uncomfortable questions about degrees of freedom. Some historians argue that all labour relationships in the colonial era involved elements of coercion, that free labour is a later development requiring particular economic and legal conditions to emerge. Others maintain that the distinction between temporary servitude and permanent heritable slavery is fundamental and shouldn't be blurred. The debate continues, and these streets provide evidence for both sides, workers in various states of freedom and unfreedom, their conditions shaped by contracts, customs, and the particular master's fate has assigned them. As afternoon edges toward evening, you reflect on the forms of labour you've witnessed today. The master craftsmen and their apprentices, the shopkeepers and their clerks, the sailors and dock workers, the enslaved and the indentured, the women whose domestic labour keeps everything functioning. Colonial Boston's economy depends on all of these, on hierarchies of labour that we've only begun to understand. The myth of early America as a land of free yeoman farmers obscures this more complicated reality, where freedom exists on a spectrum and most people live somewhere in the middle. The sun hangs low over Boston Harbour, casting long shadows across the narrow streets. The transition from day to evening brings changes that highlight just how different life is in a world without electricity. As light fades, the entire pattern of human activity shifts. Darkness is coming, and darkness in the 1750s is not the inconvenience we moderns experience, but a fundamental constraint that shapes every aspect of life. Let's walk through a colonial evening together. The first thing you notice is how quickly the streets begin to empty. Daylight hours are precious, and when the sun goes down, most outdoor work becomes impossible. Shops close their shutters, not because of arbitrary business hours, but because customers can't see merchandise in the dark and shopkeepers can't count their money. Craftsmen put aside their tools. Detailed work requires light that candles can't adequately provide. The bustle that characterised the afternoon gives way to a quieter movement of people heading home before full darkness descends. Lighting in colonial Boston comes from three main sources: fire, candles, and whale oil lamps. Each has significant limitations. Open fires provide warmth and some light, but create hazards in wooden buildings packed closely together. Candles are expensive, whether made from tallow, animal fat, or the more desirable beeswax, and they provide a small, flickering circle of illumination insufficient for fine work. Whale oil lamps burn brighter than candles, but smell strongly and cost even more. The result is that most homes use light sparingly, gathering around a single candle for necessary tasks and leaving much of the house in darkness. Here's something that might reshape your understanding of colonial life. Darkness changes sleep patterns. Modern research suggests that before artificial lighting became widespread, people commonly practiced segmented sleep, sleeping for several hours, waking for a period in the middle of the night, then sleeping again until morning. During the waking period, people might pray, talk, have sex, even visit neighbours. The unbroken 8-hour sleep block we now consider normal may actually be a modern invention, made possible by artificial light that keeps us awake until a single late bedtime. The streets at night are not entirely empty, but are far less safe than during the day. Boston maintains a night watch, citizens taking turns patrolling the streets after dark, but their effectiveness is limited. Crime thrives in darkness, and sensible people stay home unless necessity drives them out. Taverns remain open, their lights visible through windows, and the sounds of evening conviviality drift into the streets. But walking alone at night is risky, and even walking in groups doesn't guarantee safety. Fire is a constant concern that intensifies after dark. With so many buildings made of wood, with heating and lighting dependent on open flames, with no fire department in the modern sense, the risk of catastrophic fire hangs over the city. Boston has experienced devastating fires before. The Great Fire of 1711 destroyed much of the commercial district, and everyone knows another could come at any time. Each household is responsible for keeping firefighting equipment, typically leather buckets, ready, and community bucket brigades are the primary response to any outbreak. Sleeping in a colonial house means trusting that no errant spark will turn your bed into a funeral pyre. The evening routine in most households follows predictable patterns. As darkness falls, the family gathers in whatever room contains the primary fire, typically the kitchen in modest homes, a parlour in wealthier ones. Supper, a lighter meal than the midday dinner, is served. Children finish whatever tasks remain before bed. Adults might read by candlelight if they can afford the expense and possess the literacy. Women continue domestic tasks that can be done by touch, knitting, mending, simple food preparation. Men might discuss the day's events or conduct business that requires conversation rather than written records. Curfew bells ring from the churches, reminding citizens that decent people should be home. The practice dates to medieval times, and while it's not strictly enforced in 1750s Boston, it reinforces the expectation that night is for sleeping, not carousing. The night watch patrols for anyone who seems out of place, asking their business, and potentially detaining those whose answers aren't satisfactory. Freedom of movement, taken for granted during the day, becomes conditional after dark. Historians still argue about how colonists experienced the evening hours. Some emphasize the constraints, the expense of light, the dangers of darkness, the limitation of activity. Others point to the intimacy that evening created, the family gathering that darkness enforced, the conversations and connections that flourished when options for distraction were limited. Television, smartphones, and electric lights have given us evening freedom our ancestors couldn't imagine. But perhaps we've lost something too. The enforced togetherness, the shared experience of darkness, the rhythm of days that followed the sun. The taverns provide one exception to this domestic quietude. For men, women rarely appear in taverns, especially after dark. The public house offers light, warmth, company, and entertainment that the home cannot match. Tavern evening is for more serious drinking than the daytime, for games and gambling, for political arguments that become louder as cups empty and refill. Here the darkness outside seems to intensify the light within, creating pockets of sociability in a city largely gone to bed. Sex, it should be noted, happens primarily after dark, in bedrooms shared with others, under conditions that would make modern romantics cringe. Privacy is minimal. Most couples share sleeping space with children, servants, or other family members. The sounds of conjugal activity might be heard by others, who politely pretend not to notice. Courting couples find ways to be together despite the surveillance of family and community, but those ways are constrained by space, time, and the eternal danger of pregnancy outside marriage. The darkness provides some cover, but colonial sex is never truly private. As you make your way through the darkening streets toward whatever lodging awaits, you feel the vulnerability that darkness creates. Your eyes struggle to adjust, your feet stumble on uneven cobblestones. Sounds seem louder, more threatening, in the absence of visual confirmation. This is what evening means without artificial light. A retreat from the public world, a return to domestic space, a submission to the rhythms of nature that we've largely escaped. Colonial Bostonians know this darkness intimately, have arranged their lives around it, and would find our 24-hour, always lit world incomprehensible. The last light fades from the sky. Stars appear, brilliant in a way they never are in light-polluted modern cities. Somewhere, a dog barks. Somewhere else, a watchman calls the hour. The city settles into the darkness that will hold it until dawn. You've reached your lodging, perhaps a room in a boarding house, perhaps the home of family or friends, perhaps, if you're truly lucky, your own small dwelling. The door closes behind you, shutting out the dark streets and enclosing you in the smoky warmth of a colonial home in evening. Supper awaits, and with it the rituals of family gathering that structure colonial domestic life. Let's sit down together for this final meal of the day. Supper in colonial Boston is simpler than dinner. The main meal has already been eaten. Supper is meant to sustain you through the night without weighing you down before sleep. What appears depends on the household's means, but common elements include bread, cheese, perhaps some leftover meat from dinner, maybe a bit of pie or pudding if someone has taken the trouble to make it. Drinks are similar to other meals, small beer, cider, occasionally tea for the comfortable classes. Nothing fancy, nothing requiring extensive preparation, just enough to fill empty stomachs before bed. The table itself is likely a simple wooden affair, boards on trestles in modest homes or a proper fixed table in more prosperous ones. Seating is hierarchical. The head of household takes pride of place, with status decreasing around the table. Children might stand rather than sit, or eat at a separate small table. Servants and enslaved people eat separately after serving the family from whatever remains. Every meal reinforces the social structure of the household. Mealtime conversation covers the business of the day, what was accomplished, what remains to be done, what news has arrived from outside the household. The father might question children about their lessons or their work. The mother might discuss domestic matters requiring decisions, important news from the broader world, ships arrived, events in London, developments in neighbouring colonies, finds its way to the table through whatever channels have delivered it. Without newspapers, which exist but aren't daily or universal, information spreads through personal networks, and mealtimes are occasions for sharing. Here's something that defines colonial family evenings: religious observance. In many households, particularly those with strong Puritan heritage, family worship is a non-negotiable part of the day. After supper, the family gathers for Bible reading, prayer, and perhaps religious instruction. The father leads, reading passages aloud, offering commentary, praying for the family's spiritual welfare. Children are catechized, asked to recite religious questions and answers they've memorized. The session might last half an hour or more, and sleepy children who lose attention can expect sharp correction. This family worship is taken seriously because the stakes couldn't be higher. Every family member's eternal soul hangs in the balance. A father who neglects his family's spiritual instruction endangers not just himself but everyone under his roof. The catechism questions that children memorize aren't just academic exercises. They're preparation for the day of judgment, when each person will answer for their faith. Colonial parents who seemed harsh by modern standards believed they were saving their children from eternal damnation. Love, in this context, means rigorous religious instruction. Historians still argue about the nature of colonial family life. Were these families closer and more integrated than modern ones, bound together by shared labour, shared worship, shared everything? Or were they more hierarchical and restrictive, with individual members suppressed under paternal authority and religious stricture? Evidence exists for both views. Colonial families certainly spent more time together than modern ones, but whether that togetherness was warm or stifling probably varied as much then as family dynamics vary today. After supper and worship, the evening hours stretch until bedtime. What people do with this time depends on who they are and what resources they have. Reading is an option for the literate with access to books and willingness to burn candles. Some might write letters, maintaining connections with family and friends at distance. Women often continue handwork, knitting, sewing, mending, by firelight or candlelight, tasks that don't require detailed vision. Men might repair tools, whittle, or do other manual tasks suited to dim light. Conversation continues, stories are told, songs might be sung if the household is musical. Children's bedtime comes early. Growing bodies need sleep, and there's no television to argue for just one more show. The transition to bed involves whatever nighttime routines the family practices. Prayers at bedside, perhaps washing faces and hands, changing into night clothes if the family is prosperous enough to have them. Many simply sleep in their day clothes. Children sleep together, often several to a bed, warming each other in unheated chambers as the fire dies down and the house grows cold. The adults stay up somewhat longer, savouring the only hours of the day without children's constant demands. This is when married couples can talk privately, or as privately as thin walls allow, when household decisions are finalised, when concerns too weighty for daytime discussion are raised. It's also when whatever marital intimacy occurs takes place quietly, with an awareness that sounds travel and morning comes early. The fire needs banking before bed, raking coals together and covering with ash to preserve them for morning. Candles need extinguishing, each precious stub saved for future use. The house needs securing, though locks are simple and determined intruders could break through. Chamber pots are positioned for nocturnal necessity. Prayers are said, final ones, asking protection through the dangerous hours of sleep. And then bed, that rope-strung, straw-stuffed, blanket-covered destination that has awaited you all day. The mattress is cold at first. Body heat takes time to warm the space. The covers are heavy wool or linen, rough against the skin. The sounds of others in the house settling continue. Creaks, coughs, the movements of bodies seeking comfortable positions. The darkness is absolute, the kind of darkness that modern eyes rarely experience. In this darkness, minds wander to the day past and the day to come. What was accomplished? What remains? Are the children well? Is business sound? What does God require? The thoughts are not so different from modern nighttime ruminations, the universal human experience of consciousness confronting itself before sleep takes over. Colonial Bostonians might frame these thoughts in religious terms we've largely abandoned, but the underlying concerns, security, health, family meaning, are eternal. The family sleeps, each member in their assigned place, gathered under one roof against the dangers of night. This is the domestic unit that forms the foundation of colonial society, the basic building block from which everything else is constructed. It's imperfect, constrained, shaped by circumstances we'd find intolerable. It's also home, the centre of life, the place where colonial Bostonians return each night to rest before facing another day. But not everyone is sleeping. While respectable citizens have retired to their beds, another side of colonial Boston comes alive, the entertainments and diversions that relieve the grinding labour of daily life. Because people need play as well as work, even in a society deeply suspicious of idle pleasure. Let's explore how 1750s Bostonians amused themselves in the hours not claimed by labour and religious observance. The Puritan founders of Massachusetts took a dim view of entertainment. They banned theatre outright, seeing it as a school for immorality. They restricted music to religious contexts. They discouraged games of chance, dancing, and other frivolities that distracted from spiritual concerns. This heritage lingers in the 1750s. Boston has no theatre, unlike more liberal cities like New York, and public amusements face constant scrutiny. But human nature being what it is, people find ways to have fun despite official disapproval. Taverns, as we've seen, are primary entertainment venues. Beyond eating and drinking, they offer spaces for games, cards, dice, backgammon, billiards in better establishments. These games technically violate laws against gambling, but enforcement is inconsistent and stakes are often small enough to avoid attention. The sociability of the tavern, the conversation, the arguments, the camaraderie, is itself a form of entertainment, a relief from the isolation that might otherwise characterise colonial life. Music exists, though, in constrained forms. Religious music is acceptable, psalm singing is actually encouraged, and Boston has developed its own style of congregational singing. Secular music is more problematic, associated with worldliness and loose morals, but it persists. Fiddles appear at private gatherings. Songs pass from person to person, some brought from England, some developing in the colonies. Dancing happens despite official disapproval, particularly at weddings and other celebrations where normal restrictions are temporarily relaxed. Here's something that might surprise you. Public executions are entertainment. When someone is hanged for a serious crime, the event draws large crowds who treat it as a spectacle. There are sermons beforehand. Criminals are expected to confess their sins and warn others. The drama of the actual execution, and plenty of socialising around the edges. The grimness of this entertainment reflects both the public nature of justice, punishment is supposed to deter others, and the limited options for public gathering. People take their excitement where they can find it. Other public entertainments include animal baiting, dogs fighting bulls or bears, which sounds as horrible as it is, cockfighting, and horse racing. These two face official disapproval but persist on the margins of respectable society. Markets and fairs provide occasions for gathering, with jugglers, acrobats, and curiosities adding entertainment value to commercial transactions. Training days, when the militia musters, combine military drill with drinking and socialising, becoming community events as much as military ones. Holidays provide structured opportunities for celebration, though Boston's Puritan heritage limits these. Christmas, surprisingly, is controversial. The Puritans considered Christmas celebration a Catholic corruption, and Massachusetts actually banned its observance for much of the 17th century. By the 1750s, the prohibition has lapsed, and some Bostonians celebrate, but it's nothing like the major festival it will become. More important are Thanksgiving days, not the fixed November date of later tradition, but variable days appointed by authorities for specific occasions, and election days, which combine civic duty with festivity. Reading provides private entertainment for the literate. Books are expensive and precious, often read aloud to share their content with family members who can't or won't read themselves. The Bible is most common, but novels, poetry, histories, and scientific works circulate as well. Newspapers appear weekly, providing news, essays, and advertisements that inform and entertain. Almanacs, like those published by Benjamin Franklin under the pseudonym Poor Richard, mix practical information with wit and wisdom that readers enjoy. Historians still argue about how to characterize colonial leisure. The Puritan suspicion of entertainment is real and shapes the available options. But so is the human need for recreation, which finds expression despite restrictions. Were colonists perpetually sober and serious, their pleasures confined to the dutiful enjoyment of religious observance? Or did they find ways to laugh, play, and forget their troubles as people always have? The evidence suggests the latter, though always with an eye over the shoulder for authorities who might disapprove. Sports and physical recreation exist in informal forms. Wrestling, foot races, and other contests might emerge spontaneously when young men gather. Ball games of various kinds are played, though not yet organised into the formalised sports that will develop later. Swimming and skating, in season, provide both recreation and practical skill development. The physical demands of daily labour leave most people too tired for extensive exercise, but youth finds energy that must be expended somehow. Visiting, simply spending time in others' homes, is a major form of entertainment. In a world before television, radio, or internet, other people are the primary source of novelty and interest. A visit from family or friends is an event requiring preparation and providing material for conversation long after the guests have departed. The social networks that sustain colonial life are maintained through these visits, which serve practical purposes, sharing information, arranging marriages, conducting business, even as they provide pleasure. Children play as children always have, despite adult disapproval of idleness. Their games are simpler than modern ones, but recognisable. Tag, hide and seek, marbles, dolls, toy soldiers, make-believe. The play of colonial children receives less parental supervision than modern children experience. if only because parents are too busy with work to watch constantly. Unsupervised children find their own amusements, some wholesome, some probably not. As you consider colonial entertainment, you might notice what's missing. There's no passive entertainment, nothing equivalent to watching television or scrolling through social media. Entertainment requires active participation, playing games, making music, engaging in conversation. This creates a different relationship with leisure, one where amusement must be produced rather than consumed. Whether this is better or worse than our situation is a question each listener might answer differently. The moon rises over Boston Harbour, casting silver light on water and rooftops. Somewhere a fiddle plays, its sound carrying through the night air. In the taverns, men still drink and argue and laugh. In private homes, families share the small pleasures their circumstances allow. Colonial Boston is not the grim, joyless place Puritan stereotypes might suggest. It's a human community, with all the variety of human experience, finding ways to celebrate life even under difficult conditions. Speaking of human pleasures, let's turn to one of the most fundamental, love, or at least what passes for love in the complicated social and economic negotiations that constitute colonial courtship. Finding a spouse in 1750s. Boston is nothing like modern dating. No apps, no casual relationships, no seeing where things go. Marriage is too important to be left to romantic whimsy. Let's navigate the treacherous waters of colonial romance together. The first thing to understand is that marriage in colonial America is primarily an economic arrangement. Love is nice if it happens, but the foundation of marriage is practical, creating a household unit that can survive and prosper through combined labour. A man needs a wife to manage his home, produce his children, preserve his food, make his clothes, and perform the 1,000 other tasks that keep a household functioning. A woman needs a husband for legal and economic protection, for the status that marriage confers, for the children that are both her duty and her security in old age. Romance is the icing. Economics is the cake. Courtship begins with family involvement that would seem intrusive today. Parents have significant influence over who their children marry, and a young person who pursues a relationship their parents disapprove of faces serious consequences. This parental control reflects the economic stakes. A daughter who marries badly reflects on her family, and potentially becomes a burden if the marriage fails. A son who marries without dowry weakens the family's economic position. Consent matters, but it's not purely individual consent. Here's a quirky practice that might make you smile. Bundling. This is the custom of allowing courting couples to spend the night together in bed, but fully clothed, and sometimes with a board down the middle of the bed to prevent inappropriate contact. Bundling sounds scandalous, but serves practical purposes in a world without central heating or private courting spaces. Young people can talk intimately, get to know each other, assess compatibility, all while, in theory, remaining chaste. How often the theory matched reality is something historians continue to debate. The economics of marriage are formalised through dowries and settlements. A bride's family provides a dowry, money, goods or property that the bride brings to the marriage. In exchange, the groom or his family might provide a jointure, a promise of financial support for the wife if she becomes a widow. These negotiations can become quite complex, involving lawyers and detailed contracts, particularly among wealthy families. Love might bring two people together, but lawyers finalise the deal. Women have limited agency in this system, but they're not entirely powerless. A woman can refuse to marry someone she finds repugnant, and courts will generally support her refusal. She can pursue a man she prefers using whatever feminine arts her culture has taught her. Within the constraints of the system, she can negotiate for better terms, for more control over her dowry, for protections that will become important if her husband dies or proves abusive. It's not equality, but it's not complete powerlessness either. Historians still argue about whether colonial marriages were typically happy or unhappy. On one hand, the economic foundation seems cold and calculated, leaving little room for emotional connection. On the other hand, couples who expected partnership rather than romance might have found satisfaction in relationships that modern standards would consider inadequate. The sources are limited. Colonists didn't keep diaries focused on their emotional lives the way modern people might, but evidence suggests the usual human range of marital experiences, from genuine affection to bitter resentment. Scandal lurks around the edges of colonial romance. Premarital sex is officially forbidden but clearly happens. The number of babies born within 8 months of marriage tells its own story. Couples caught in fornication face public censure and legal punishment. The woman, who cannot hide pregnancy, bears the heavier burden. Adultery is even more serious, theoretically punishable by death, though actual executions are rare. The community monitors sexual behaviour with a vigilance that makes small-town gossip seem benign. Weddings themselves are relatively simple affairs compared to modern productions. There's no white dress, the bride wears her best clothes, whatever colour they might be. Ceremonies are religious, conducted by ministers, but without the elaborate rituals of Catholic or Anglican tradition. A reception might follow, with food and drink and celebration, but the scale depends on the family's means. For most people, a wedding is a solemn occasion more than a festive one, marking the creation of a new household with prayers for its success. After marriage, the couple settles into the routine of domestic partnership. The husband's authority is legally absolute. He controls all property, makes all major decisions, and has the right to physically discipline his wife, within limits. Excessive cruelty is theoretically actionable. The wife manages the household, raises the children, and contributes the domestic labour without which the family cannot function. In practice, many marriages involve more negotiation and partnership than the legal structure suggests. Women influence decisions through persuasion and management of their domestic domains. Divorce is theoretically possible but practically very difficult. Massachusetts allows divorce more readily than most colonies, but the grounds are limited: adultery, desertion, extreme cruelty, and the process is complex. Most unhappy couples simply endure, separated from each other in spirit if not in law. The phrase "till death do us part" is not romantic flourish. It's literal description of a commitment that cannot easily be escaped. You watch a young couple walking together in the evening, supervised by a chaperone but clearly absorbed in each other. Their situation, the families watching, the economic calculations, the limited options, the permanent commitment they're considering, would feel oppressive to modern sensibilities. But they're also experiencing something universal: the excitement of connection, the hope of building a life together, the mysterious attraction that draws people to each other across every culture and century. Colonial Boston constrains romance but cannot eliminate it. The night watch calls an hour, his voice echoing through streets gone dark and quiet. Boston sleeps mostly, but the law never entirely slumbers. Tomorrow, as on every day, the mechanisms of colonial justice will grind forward, hearing cases, punishing crimes, enforcing the order that makes urban life possible. Let's explore what law and order mean in 1750s Boston, and prepare yourself. It's not always pretty. The legal system of colonial Massachusetts combines English common law traditions with local modifications developed over more than a century of settlement. Courts meet regularly to hear cases ranging from minor disputes over debts to serious crimes warranting death. The judges are prominent citizens, often without formal legal training but respected for their wisdom and standing. Lawyers exist but are viewed with some suspicion. Many colonists represent themselves in court, and the proceedings are less formal than modern standards would allow. The crimes that most concern colonial authorities fall into several categories: property crimes, theft, fraud, counterfeiting, threaten the economic foundations of society, moral crimes, fornication, adultery, blasphemy, Sabbath breaking, offend the religious sensibilities that still shape New England law, violent crimes, assault, rape, murder, endanger persons and public peace. Each category brings its own punishments, calibrated to both deter future offences and provide public satisfaction that justice has been served. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Punishment in colonial Boston is public, physical, and designed to shame. The stocks and pillory stand in public squares, ready to receive those convicted of minor offences. The offender sits or stands in public view, sometimes for hours, exposed to the mockery and abuse of passing citizens. This is punishment as spectacle, designed not just to hurt the individual, but to demonstrate the community's power over wrongdoing. Whipping is common for more serious offences. A public whipping might involve dozens of lashes, laid on with enough force to draw blood and leave permanent scars. The victim is tied to a post, stripped to the waist and beaten while the community watches. This is meant to be horrifying. Punishment works through fear, and witnessing punishment is supposed to deter potential criminals. Modern sensibilities recoil from such brutality, but colonists accepted it as necessary for maintaining order. Branding marks certain criminals permanently. A thief might be branded with a T on their hand, a perjurer with a P on their forehead. These marks identify the criminal forever, preventing them from escaping their past through geographic mobility. The brand is both punishment and warning. This person has violated community trust and should be treated with appropriate caution. There's no concept of paying your debt to society and starting fresh. Criminal identity is permanent. Capital punishment exists for the most serious crimes. Murder, rape, arson, treason, and some cases of adultery theoretically warrant execution, though in practice death sentences are rarer than the law suggests. When they do occur, they're public events, the entire community invited to witness the ultimate punishment. The condemned typically confesses sins and warns others before mounting the gallows, adding a religious dimension to the legal proceedings. Historians still argue about whether colonial justice was harsh or lenient by the standards of its time. Compared to England, where hundreds of offences were technically capital, Massachusetts punished less severely. The famous Puritan strictness often yielded to practical mercy, with judges finding reasons to impose lighter sentences than the law allowed. But compared to modern standards, the physical brutality, the public shaming, and the permanent marking of criminals seem impossibly cruel. The goal of colonial punishment is deterrence and reformation, not rehabilitation in the modern sense. There are no prisons. Incarceration is used only for holding people awaiting trial, not as punishment in itself. The idea that criminals might be reformed through programs and treatment hasn't yet emerged. Instead, punishment aims to make crimes so painful and shameful that potential criminals will be deterred and actual criminals will be too broken to reoffend. Whether this works is questionable, but it's the theory underlying the system. Enforcement is largely community-based. There's no professional police force in colonial Boston. Keeping order is everyone's responsibility. The Night Watch, composed of citizens taking turns, patrols after dark. The constable, an elected official, serves warrants and maintains basic order during the day, but much law enforcement happens informally, through neighbours watching neighbours, reporting suspicious behaviour, and collectively maintaining standards. Privacy as we understand it barely exists. Your affairs are everyone's business. The legal system also handles civil matters, disputes over property, contracts, debts, and other non-criminal issues. These cases often reveal the economic tensions underlying colonial society: merchants suing debtors, landlords evicting tenants, neighbours disputing property boundaries. Colonial law generally favours creditors and property owners, reinforcing existing economic hierarchies. A poor person suing a wealthy one faces an uphill battle, not just in the courtroom but in a society where legal standing and social standing intertwine. Women's access to the legal system is limited by the coverture doctrine we discussed earlier. A married woman cannot sue in her own name. Her husband must bring any action on her behalf. She cannot be sued either, which might seem like protection, but actually reflects her legal invisibility. She has no personhood against which claims can be made. Unmarried women have more standing but face practical obstacles that limit their legal participation. You walk past the stocks, empty now in the darkness, waiting for tomorrow's offenders. The wood is worn smooth by generations of hands and feet, evidence of how regularly they're used. Nearby, a post bears dark stains that might be old blood, remnants of whippings past. These instruments of justice seem barbaric, but they're the tools colonial Boston uses to maintain the order that makes community life possible. Every society enforces norms, every society punishes deviation. The methods differ, but the underlying logic that social life requires consequences for rule breaking remains constant. As we approach the end of our journey through colonial Boston, we need to acknowledge something rumbling beneath the surface: politics. The year is 1750, and while the revolution is still more than 2 decades away, the tensions that will eventually explode into war are already building. The Bostonians you've met today are British subjects, loyal mostly to their king, but they're also developing ideas about rights, representation and liberty that will soon challenge imperial authority. Let's explore the political world of colonial Boston, where the future is being shaped in tavern conversations and town meetings. The political structure of Massachusetts is relatively democratic by 18th century standards. The colony has an elected assembly, the General Court, that passes laws and allocates taxes. Towns govern themselves through town meetings, gatherings of propertied male citizens who vote directly on local issues. By comparison with England, where parliamentary seats are often controlled by aristocrats, and the vast majority cannot vote, Massachusetts offers broader participation in governance. This experience of self-rule is creating habits and expectations that will later seem revolutionary. The property requirement for voting, you must own a certain amount of land or other property, excludes many, but Massachusetts has relatively wide property ownership compared to England or other colonies. Many farmers and craftsmen meet the threshold, giving them a stake in political decisions that seems remarkable by the standards of the time. This doesn't mean democracy as we understand it. Women, enslaved people, indigenous peoples, and the propertyless poor have no voice. But it does mean that political participation extends beyond a tiny elite. Here's what's interesting about the 1750s. Tensions between colony and crown are real, but not yet focused on independence. Colonists object to specific policies, restrictions on manufacturing, requirements to house soldiers, interference with colonial trade, without questioning the basic relationship with Britain. They see themselves as Englishmen with the rights of Englishmen, demanding that Parliament respect those rights, not as Americans seeking to create a new nation. The idea of independence would seem radical, even treasonous to most Bostonians you might meet. Town meetings are where political life happens at the local level. These gatherings bring together the propertied men of the community to decide practical matters. Roads, schools, poor relief, local ordinances. They also provide training in democratic practice, speaking, debating, voting, accepting majority decisions that will prove important when larger issues arise. The town meeting tradition, often traced back to Puritan origins, creates citizens accustomed to participating in governance rather than passively accepting decisions made by others. The taverns, as mentioned earlier, serve as informal political spaces. Over drinks, men discuss events, share opinions, and gradually develop the consensus that will eventually challenge imperial authority. Samuel Adams is already active in Boston politics in the 1750s, building networks and articulating grievances that will become explosive in the following decade. The revolution doesn't emerge from nowhere. It grows in conversations that are happening now in this time period, among people very much like those you've encountered today. Historians still argue about the origins of the American Revolution. Was it fundamentally about ideas, liberty, representation, natural rights, or about interests, merchants protecting their trade, property owners defending their holdings? Was it a democratic movement or an elite manipulation? These debates continue because the revolution was complex enough to support multiple interpretations. But whatever its deeper causes, it grew from the political culture that colonial Boston is developing in the 1750s. The relationship between colonial and imperial authority is complicated. The royal governor, appointed by the king, represents crown interests but must work with the colonial assembly to govern effectively. The assembly controls the purse strings, the power to levy taxes, and uses this leverage to check gubernatorial power. The result is ongoing negotiation, sometimes collaborative and sometimes contentious, between local and imperial authority. When this balance tips, when Parliament tries to impose direct taxation or other controls, the conflict will intensify. Religion interweaves with politics in ways that seem strange to modern secular sensibilities. Ministers preach election sermons, offering divine guidance for political choices. Political arguments are framed in religious terms, with opponents cast as enemies of God's order. The Great Awakening of the 1730s and 1740s, that wave of religious revival, had political implications too, challenging established authorities, empowering ordinary believers, creating divisions that mapped onto political ones. Politics and religion are not separate spheres in colonial Boston. They're different aspects of the same community life. You pass by the townhouse, what will later be called the Old State House, where colonial government meets and where, in a few decades, events leading to the Boston Massacre will unfold. For now, it's just a government building, its brick walls solid and respectable, giving no hint of the transformation it will witness. History doesn't announce itself, it accumulates quietly until something ignites. The colonists you've met today, the merchants, the craftsmen, the sailors, the servants, will many of them live to see the revolution unfold? Their children will fight in it or resist it or try to stay neutral as the conflict tears through communities. The ideas being developed now in seemingly abstract debates about representation and rights will become matters of life and death. The world is about to change, though no one quite realises how much. But for now, in 1750, Boston sleeps. Politics can wait for tomorrow's tavern arguments and town meeting debates. The wheels are turning, but the destination is not yet visible. There's work to be done, families to feed, souls to save, and all the ordinary concerns of ordinary life that continue regardless of what great events historians will later identify. Revolution begins in ordinary days like this one, lived by ordinary people who cannot know what's coming. The calendar in colonial Boston marks time differently than you might expect. The rhythm of the year follows patterns both familiar and strange, structured by seasons, religious observances, and civic occasions that give shape to days that might otherwise blur together. Let's explore how Bostonians experience the passing of time, the holidays they celebrate, or conspicuously don't celebrate, and the seasonal rhythms that govern their lives. Winter in Boston is brutal. The cold is intense, the wind off the harbour cutting, the days short and dark. Heating comes entirely from wood fires, which cannot warm entire houses and leave people constantly chilled from November through March. The harbour might freeze, cutting off waterborne commerce and the fresh fish that supplement diets during warmer months. Winter is a season of endurance, of conserving resources, of waiting for the return of light and warmth. But winter also brings certain pleasures. The frozen harbour provides ice for skating. Snow offers opportunities for sleigh rides. The enforced domestic togetherness can be comforting when families gather around fires against the cold outside. And the turning of the year, even if Christmas is controversial, provides a marker of time's passage, a reminder that even the darkest days will eventually brighten. Here's something that might surprise you. Christmas in colonial Boston is not the major holiday it becomes in later centuries. The Puritan founders actively banned Christmas celebration, seeing it as a Catholic corruption, a remnant of pagan midwinter festivals covered with Christian veneer. By the 1750s, the formal ban has lapsed, and some Bostonians do observe the day, but it's far from the universal celebration we know. Shops stay open, work continues. The elaborate traditions of Christmas trees, gift-giving and family gathering haven't yet developed. December 25th is, for many Bostonians, just another winter day. More significant are the Thanksgiving days appointed by colonial authorities. These aren't the fixed November celebration of later tradition, but variable days declared for specific occasions: a military victory, a successful harvest, recovery from epidemic. When a Thanksgiving Day is announced, the community gathers for religious services, then typically enjoys a special meal. These days provide the template for what will eventually become the national Thanksgiving holiday, but they're occasional rather than annual, tied to specific events rather than a calendar date. Fast days serve as the opposite of Thanksgivings, days set aside for communal fasting and prayer, acknowledging divine displeasure and seeking restoration of God's favour. When things go badly, drought, disease, military defeat, authorities might appoint a fast day, calling the community to collective repentance. These days are taken seriously. Businesses close, meals are skipped, prayers are lengthy. The fast day tradition reflects the Puritan conviction that God actively intervenes in human affairs and must be propitiated when things go wrong. Election days are occasions for both civic duty and celebration. The annual election of colonial officials brings people together, first for the serious business of choosing leaders, and then for the festivities that follow. Election cakes, specially baked treats, mark the occasion. Drinking, socialising, and general conviviality follow the formal proceedings. Election Day is one of the few occasions when ordinary people can gather publicly for extended celebration, without falling afoul of Puritan suspicion of idle pleasure. Spring brings relief from winter's grip and the beginning of the agricultural year. Even in urban Boston, the rhythms of farming affect daily life. Food becomes fresher as gardens produce. Trade increases as the harbour opens. The general mood lightens as warmth and light return. Spring is also a dangerous time. The sickly season that often follows winter's end can bring epidemics, as people emerge from their shelters and begin mingling again. Historians still argue about how colonists experience seasonal time. In a world without artificial lighting and heating, the seasons impose themselves more forcefully than in our climate-controlled environment. Winter really was a time of scarcity, of shortened activity, of survival rather than thriving. Summer really was a time of abundance, of long work days taking advantage of extended daylight. The modern flattening of seasonal difference, the same activities available year-round, the same comforts regardless of weather, was unknown in colonial Boston. Summer brings its own challenges: heat that makes labour exhausting, humidity that encourages disease, long work days that stretch from dawn to dusk. But it also brings abundance: fresh produce from gardens, fish in vast quantities, the prosperity that trade brings when the harbour is active. The summer social calendar includes training days, when the militia musters for drill and celebration combined, and various local festivals that communities develop around their particular circumstances. Fall is harvest time, the culmination of the agricultural year, when the success or failure of farming efforts becomes clear. Apples are pressed for cider, vegetables are preserved for winter, livestock that cannot be fed through winter are slaughtered and the meat salted or smoked. The Thanksgiving days that follow successful harvests express genuine gratitude for survival. In a world without grocery stores and refrigeration, a failed harvest means real hunger. Throughout the year, the weekly rhythm of Sabbath observance structures time. Every Sunday brings church attendance, rest from labour, and the religious obligations that most Bostonians accept as normal. The week builds towards Sunday and restarts after it, creating a pattern that gives shape to days that might otherwise lose definition. The Sabbath is both burden and gift, a day of obligation that is also a day of rest, a break from unrelenting labour. You feel the season in your bones as another day in colonial Boston draws to a close. Whether winter's chill or summer's heat, the weather is inescapable in ways that air conditioning and central heating make hard to remember. The year stretches ahead, with its festivals and fast days, its seasons of plenty and scarcity, its rhythms as fixed and inevitable as the turning of the earth. Colonial Bostonians live within these rhythms rather than fighting against them, accepting that human schedules must bend to natural ones. And so, at last, we return to where we began, to bed, to sleep, to the end of another day in colonial Boston. The fire has been banked, the candles extinguished, the house secured against the night. You climb the creaking stairs, avoiding the cold spots where drafts slip through imperfect walls. The chamber awaits, dark and chill, the bed a dim shape in the absolute blackness of a world without artificial light. The process of preparing for sleep is simpler than the morning's elaborate dressing. You might change into a night shift or simply loosen your day clothes, depending on the household's means and habits. Shoes come off. Finally, after a long day of walking on hard surfaces, perhaps you splash a bit of water on your face. Though the basin is cold and the incentive is low, prayers are said, kneeling beside the bed, words that have been repeated so many times they flow without conscious thought. The bed itself presents its nightly negotiations. If you're sharing, and most people share, there's the question of who sleeps where, who gets more blankets, whose cold feet will inevitably find whose warm legs in the middle of the night. Children are already asleep, their breathing soft and regular in the darkness. Adults settle in around them, finding positions that balance comfort against the bed's limitations. The rough mattress, the uneven support of rope webbing that needs tightening. The sounds of the house settling accompany your descent towards sleep. Boards creak as they cool. Something skitters in the walls. Mice, probably, a constant presence in colonial homes despite all efforts to control them. Somewhere, someone coughs. Somewhere else, the last embers of the banked fire shift and sigh. These are the sounds of a world that is never quite silent, never quite still, always alive with small movements and tiny dramas invisible in the dark. Your mind wanders through the day just past. The bells that woke you, the cold wash water, the layered clothing, the hasty pudding breakfast, the streets full of pigs and mud, the harbour busy with ships from across the Atlantic, the work of the craftsmen, the labour of the women, the burdens of the enslaved and indentured, the tavern dinner, the church's constant presence, the children's lessons and the court's punishments. All the texture of colonial life so different from what you knew before, yet so fundamentally human. You think of the people you've encountered, each with their own concerns, their own hopes, their own daily struggles. The merchant worrying about ships that might or might not arrive. The apprentice dreaming of mastery someday, the housewife whose labour never ends, the enslaved man whose inner life his enslaver cannot see, the minister convinced he tends souls at the edge of damnation, the child who doesn't know yet how hard life will be. Colonial Boston is full of such people, living their ordinary lives without knowing that history will remember their time as a turning point. The darkness softens thought, blurs edges, begins the gentle slide towards sleep. Your body relaxes into the mattress, muscles finally releasing the tension they've held all day. The rough blankets, hated this morning, now offer comfort as the night's cold settles in. Breath slows, heartbeat steadies. The boundary between waking and sleeping grows porous. Thoughts drifting without direction, images floating up and dissolving. Colonial Boston sleeps around you. In thousands of wooden houses, in tens of thousands of lumpy beds, the people of this city are doing exactly what you're doing now, letting go of consciousness, surrendering to the body's need for rest. Tomorrow will bring the same challenges, the same work, the same rhythms of survival, but that's tomorrow. Tonight, there's only the darkness, the warmth, gradually building under the covers, the blessed relief of not having to do anything more. Let the church bells fade from memory. Let the streets and ships and shops recede into dream. Let the weight of history, all those events we know are coming, the revolution, the industrialization, the world transformed, let it all slip away. You don't know the future, not really. You only know this moment, this bed, this breath, this gentle drift towards sleep. The last of the day's sounds fade, the mice grow quiet, the fire settles into its long, slow burn that will, with luck, leave embers for morning. Somewhere far off, a dog barks once, then goes silent. The moon moves across the sky, casting silver light that filters dimly through oiled paper windows, touching nothing, illuminating nothing, just present as it has been for billions of years and will be for billions more. And so, dear listener, our journey through colonial Boston comes gently to its close. You've walked these streets with me, breathed this air, felt the texture of a world long past yet still somehow present in the stories we tell and the history we inherit. The bells are silent now. The harbour rests beneath a canopy of stars. The city, rough, vital, challenging, human, holds its breath in the deep stillness that comes before dawn. Let your own breath slow, matching the rhythm of a world at rest. Feel the weight of blankets around you, warmer than any colonial bedding, softer than any straw mattress. You're safe here, in this present moment, surrounded by comforts those Bostonians could not imagine. The cold cannot reach you. The work can wait. The challenges of your own life, so different yet so similar to theirs, can rest until morning. Sleep now as they slept, as humans have always slept, trusting the night to pass and the sun to return. Let the gentle weight of history settle over you like a blanket, connecting you to all those who came before, all those who lay down in the dark and hoped for tomorrow. Their dreams have faded into time, but dreaming itself continues, that universal human gift, that nightly journey into the mystery of consciousness. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, let colonial Boston fade like the last glow of embers, warm in memory, gentle in departure. Tomorrow the world will need you again. But tonight there is only peace, only rest, only the soft embrace of sleep. Sweet dreams.